In addition, the applicant may appeal the matter to the local planning appeal tribunal if council does not adopt an amendment within 150 days of receipt of the application for zoning and 210 days for an official plan amendment. A comment sheet is available over there under that TV set for anyone wishing to submit written comments on those amendments. Now, before we begin, if you've been here, a lot of you in the room have been here dozens of times. You're going to notice that there's more councillors than usual seated around the tables this morning, and that's because one of the items to be considered here today is the R4 and multi-unit residential zoning review. The effects of changes to the definitions of terms, including dwelling unit and rooming house, will be concentrated primarily on the inner urban area and in neighborhoods around colleges and universities. However, these proposals may, in principle, affect residential uses in all zones citywide, including in the rural area. For this reason, the Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee will hold a special meeting concurrently with the Planning Committee in this room this morning solely on this item to consider the R4 report. While this is a procedural variation from our usual way of doing business, we believe it will achieve a more efficient process in this instance. So here's how the process is going to work. I've just called the Planning Committee meeting to order. In a moment, Chair Moffat will call the Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee to order and read his usual statement regarding matters to be considered today under the Planning Act, as I just did. I will then resume the chair for Planning Committee, and we will proceed through the consent agenda to see which items members are prepared to carry. And really, the purpose of that is so that any of you that don't have to stay can leave. We'll then return to item 1, the R4 and multi-unit residential zoning review, which both committees will consider simultaneously. We'll hear a presentation from staff, after which we will entertain delegations, questions to staff, and then debate. To keep it simple, I will facilitate this portion of the meeting for both committees. Please note the delegations will be permitted to speak just once, not twice, so you don't get to speak to the ARAC committee and the Planning Committee. We'll be limited to 5 minutes per person, as is the usual condition. These delegations will be heard by both committees at the same time, and members of both committees will be permitted to ask questions. Following debate, I will turn the meeting over to Chair Moffat to call for a vote on the matter from ARAC members. When they have reached a decision and concluded their discussion of the matter, the ARAC meeting will be adjourned and the Planning Committee meeting will resume. At that time, I will call for a vote on the matter from the members of the Planning Committee. Upon conclusion of the item, we'll proceed with consideration of any items held on the remainder of our agenda as usual. The recommendations of each committee in respect of the R4 report will rise to Council on June the 13th, and Planning Committee's report to Council. So over to Chair Moffat.
Good morning and welcome to the May 22nd meeting of the Agricultural Affairs Committee. It's great to have so many people in attendance today for Agricultural Affairs. Just call the meeting to order. This is a special meeting, as Councillor Harder, Chair Harder said. I must do the same. This is the special meeting of the Agricultural Affairs Committee to consider the proposed zoning bylaw amendment regarding R4 multi-unit residential zoning review, listed at item 1 on today's agenda. For this item, only those who make oral submissions today or written submissions before the amendments are adopted may appeal the matter to the local planning appeal tribunal. In addition, the applicant may appeal the matter to the local planning appeal tribunal if council does not adopt an amendment within 150 days of receipt of the application for zoning and 210 days for an official plan amendment. A comment sheet is available at the door for those wishing to comment on these amendments. So we'll, as Chair Harder said, we'll consider the item concurrently, and I will pass the chair back to Chair Harder to carry on through her consent agenda.
Hopefully this will get easier through the governance review we'll do in the fall. Having said that, we have any declarations of interest. Now, am I asking for both committees?
Just yours.
What about his declaration?
Any declarations of interest on the Agricultural Affairs Committee? No? Great.
No? How about for planning? No declarations of interest? Okay. Confirmation of our minutes from the May 8th meeting. Any comments? Are they carried? Carried. Oh, communications. We have a transit-oriented affordable housing response to an inquiry from Councillor Leeper, and he would like to lift this item. And this is not going to be first, this would be last. So are you in agreement? Do we need 3/4 for that? 2/3. Does anybody object to it? So we'll lift that and have it on at the end?
Why at the end?
Because that's when it's going to be, at the end. Okay? It's when it's going to be. So do you want it at the end? Because that's where it will be. Sure. Okay, it's lifted. All right, so we know that we're dealing with R4 and multi-unit residential zoning review. The next item is zoning bylaw and official plan amendment, part of 930 Carling Avenue and 520 Preston Street. We have speakers. This is the new Civic Trauma Hospital. We'll hold that item. The next item is the community design plan, master servicing study, master transportation study, environmental management plan, area parks plan, and official plan amendments for Barrhaven South urban expansion area. We don't have any speakers. Let me just check. Then ask your question right now or in person. Well, I don't really think that when we have no speakers. Okay, so apparently some people thought that the meeting was being held in the chamber, and including Councillor Shirelli. That's where he was, and there's other people sitting down there. So would we have somebody go down and make sure that anybody that's down there comes up here, please? I think most of the items are going to be held anyway, so it's kind of going to be a moot point. Maybe we should have, now that I see the numbers of people coming in here. So Hugo, Lalone, and Sue Murphy, Minto, if needed. So is your question fast? Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just a question on this item, not so much dealing with the CDP, but with the official plan amendment and the urban expansion lands. I just wanted to understand better if staff are now recommending that additional lands be added to the urban expansion area because the sand and gravel pits have certain restrictions in terms of what one is allowed to build around them. Was that not anticipated when these lands were originally earmarked for urban expansion? I'm just trying to understand why this change is being recommended now and why, when this land was originally proposed for urban expansion, it wasn't recognized that these gravel and sand pits exist.
Through you, Madam Chair, my name is Robin Vanderline. I'm the author of the report before you today. To answer your question, Councillor Nussbaum, the OPA 76 described the entirety of the Area 7 for development during the future planning period, so by 2031. Those included the lands. Those included those lands that are under sand and gravel, the two sand and gravel operations now. So they were anticipated to be cleared and ready to be into the urban boundary, or rather developed by 2031. So they're part of that overall supply of land that was determined to be required by 2031 and through OPA 76. Those includes the lands that are the subject of a substitution from one side to another. So there was an area of 7C, which is not a sand and gravel operation, but which is adjacent to it and would be substituted for some lands on the eastern edge. This is both of the lands were anticipated. The lands were anticipated to be developed by 2031 without any encumbrance, but the adjustment was made now. We've done a similar instance.
Okay, hang on. That's probably enough. Councillor Nussbaum, anything else?
Well, just
because I will hold it if we're going to continue on.
Well, just to see if I just want to summarize to see if I understand. So, at the time that this land was proposed, staff anticipated that those pits would be closed by now or before 2031 so as to allow development to occur. As it happens, 10 years later, wherever we are, extraction continues, and therefore it's not anticipated that they will be closed and ready in time for growth to occur before 2031. Is that a decent summary?
Sorry, Councillor, no, that's not. The intent is for those sand and gravel pits to be developed by 2031. They are at the end of their life now, and it's anticipated that, I've spoken with both operators, that they will cease very soon, within, I think, 5 years at the latest.
Well then, if that's the case, then why is there a need for additional expansion lands to be included?
Okay, that's it, because we're going to have to
Okay,
hold it, I'm
fine.
sorry.
That's fine
Or
with
you
me.
can ask them offline, because does anyone else have any questions? Does anyone else have any questions on this item? So because it's going to be a long time till it comes back, I'm just saying that you could ask. I thought it was going to be a short period of time. Well, is it going to be a short period of time? Because I haven't even gone through the consent yet. Okay, go ahead. I don't really want to hold it because I have a lot of people in this room, and I'd like some of them to get seats, and some of them will get seats if we can move on this one. One question.
So in some ways, I'm more confused now. So if it's true that these are going to close and growth will occur before 2031, then why is there need for substitute or additional lands to be added to the expansion area?
Madam Chair, there's no new lands being added in the urban boundary. The substitution is on lands that are adjacent. The pits continue. The pits are in the urban boundary. When they're closed, they will be developed. The lands that were adjacent are back out of the urban area, and there's new areas that were not previously that are clear of those pits that we are including. So it's a one-for-one substitution.
That was very clear. Okay. So we do have Hugo Lalonde and Sue Murphy, if needed. Does anyone else need them? Do you need to speak? Okay. Is this item carried? Thank you. Okay, number 4, we're holding, and this is the zoning bylaw amendment for 398, 402, and 406 Roosevelt Avenue. We have a lot of speakers on that one. Number 5 is zoning bylaw amendment, 320 McRae Avenue and 315 Tweedsmuir Avenue. We're holding that. We have speakers. Number 6 is Maryville Road North, community design plan and zoning bylaw amendment. We have a speaker, so we'll hold that one. Nope. Number 7 is the, hopefully we can carry this one, is the, I don't have a speaker, and it's pretty simple. Exemption to permanent signs on private property bylaw mural at 93 Carruthers Avenue. Yahoo. Thank you. Number 8 is a designation. This is a Built Heritage Subcommittee. It's risen from there. Designation of the Ottawa Rowing Club Boathouse, 8 to 10 Lady Gray Drive, under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. This is the Ottawa Rowing Club Boathouse. We don't have any speakers. Does anyone have any questions? Is it carried? Carried? Like nod or something to me. Something. I only need one person. Thank you. Okay, and then we have in information previously distributed, we have findings of monitoring of infill 1 and infill 2 bylaws. Okay, so now we are going back to our joint committee. Concurrent and joint committee. So anyone of the possibly 3 people or something that might not have to stay, feel free to leave. And since we have a lot of people standing, I would like to ask staff if they can get a few folding chairs so that we can accommodate some people wherever possible. Of course, as long as we're not breaking the fire code or something. All right. So we have a presentation on the R4 and multi-unit residential zoning review. I see Mr. Weiss coming up and Tim Mormon. On item number 6, we have the Marlborough Road North Community Design Plan and Zoning Bylaw Amendment. We do have a speaker, Mr. Brinker, Robert Brinker. Robert, you have let your Councillor Brockington, know that you don't need to speak. You're here for support. So if no one has any questions for Mr. Brinker, you don't need to speak then? Thank you. So on this item, it's item 6, which is the Marlborough Road CDP in Councillor Brockington's ward, is carried. Yeah. Okay, it's carried. Thank you. Good. You are free to go, sir. Are we ready, gentlemen? We have 4 speakers on this so far.
All right, good morning, Madam Chair, members of Planning Committee, and members of the Agricultural Rural Affairs Committee, and good morning, Chair Moffat, to this concurrent session. It's an interesting timey-wimey experience before us today, so I'm pleased to present the R4 before both of you. Before we begin, I wanted to acknowledge the hard work and efforts of an interdisciplinary team. Although this is a zoning report that is coming before you today, the fact of the matter is that the R4 report and the issues associated with the R4 report are not specifically zoning issues. They are also bylaw enforcement issues, they are licensing issues, they are development review issues, they are building code issues. And we have had a tremendous interdisciplinary team from building code, from development review, from bylaw and licensing, who have worked hand in hand with us to try and understand the meat of this issue and work towards developing solutions that we can then collaboratively begin to work forward. The zoning review that you will see here before you and the recommendations that are presented will form the foundation for future work. The zoning bylaw is a foundational piece. It is a structural piece. And it is a piece that will hinge upon a number of other bylaws to effectively implement and move forward, and a number of other departments within the city to also effectively move forward as well, too. I'd also like to acknowledge the hard work of Mr. Tim Moorman beside me as well, too, who has been working on this issue tirelessly for several years and whom all of you know has been very actively involved in this as well, too. The problem, if I may, is to begin with the issue of what has been happening in some of our inner urban communities. As the zoning bylaw provides now, there are no limitations on the number of bedrooms in any typology whatsoever, whether it is a detached home, a semi-detached, a triplex, an apartment building. What has happened is we have seen over the last few years, over the last number of years, a stretching of the planning intent of allowing 3 or 4 dwelling units to occur in a building by allowing multiple numbers of bedrooms to occur in those same apartments, far beyond what was ever originally intended. And we have seen this in all typologies, again, detached, semi-detached, triplex, and all the way up. We have seen in some cases apartments with 6, 8, 10, or even 12 bedrooms within them. We have seen secondary dwelling units with 4, 5, or 6 bedrooms occurring within them. We have noted that in general terms, these oversized units have operated more like rooming houses. By that I mean that they are rented by the room, they are used as individual occupancies, but they are not technically rooming houses under the zoning bylaw. As such, they have operated within a gray area that the zoning bylaw did not intend, but nevertheless was something that they were permitted to do under the existing framework that exists today. And so when we look at what the official plan would have intended, when we look at what the zoning bylaw would have intended, on the left we would see a triplex that might have 3 separate households operating within them, 2, 3, 4 bedroom type of things. And what instead we are seeing in many cases across some of our neighborhoods is we are seeing triplexes or semi-detached with many more occupants per unit than those housing typologies were ever intended to actually occupy. When we look at the number of households that are out there, we know that as you increase the number of occupants in a room and the number of occupants in a unit, the opportunity for those households to occupy a typology becomes smaller and smaller. 92% of households in Ottawa are 4 people or fewer. That does not mean that 5-person households don't exist. Of course they do. 6-person households exist. Of course they do. 7- and 8-person households also exist. Of course they do. But the opportunity and the percentage of them existing in a normal fabric becomes smaller and smaller as you move up the spectrum. We know that only 3% from Statistics Canada resources have 6 people or more. So the amendment that the zoning and interpretation team are proposing to you today are the following 5. We would propose to limit dwelling units to 4 bedrooms in any zone except in a detached dwelling limited to 8 bedrooms. And this would be called an oversized dwelling unit. Why 8? We have chosen the number 8 because we know again that the percentage of households out there are 8-family households in existence, there are 6-person households in existence, but there are technical reasons as well too that my colleague Tim Moorman will get into in more detail as we go on. We will redefine and regulate the use rooming house in conjunction with future amendments to be passed by our colleagues to more clearly and effectively distinguish it from the uses dwelling unit and oversized dwelling unit. Again, this is to provide that structural clarity within the zoning bylaw to allow for future enforcement action by other branches to move forward. We will also establish minimum standards for garbage management for residential buildings exceeding 400 square meters in floor area. This closes a gap between when the waste management bylaw will kick in, which is for 6 units and more, and for what is happening in more of the low-rise type developments, where we're seeing these large floor area buildings going forward with no waste management provisions at all. We will remove the zoning distinction between a purpose-built rooming house, a converted rooming house, and groups of rooming units. We know that there is an ability for applicants to make conversions, make additions and changes before doing a conversion and before doing any subsequent application. And so therefore we think that this change will provide again additional clarity as to what is and is not permitted within our neighborhoods. And finally, we will also recommend other incidental or structural amendments to the zoning bylaw, including additional definitions that will help to give effect to the above intent and to improve clarity. And what I would like to do, Madam and Mr. Chair, is move over to my colleague Tim Moorman, who will walk you through some of the details of what it is that we are intending to do.
Yeah, good. So under the proposed zoning, we would have by definition the definition of a dwelling unit that it contains no more than 4 bedrooms. Again, this is enough to accommodate 92% of households, at least 92% of households. And we would allow dwelling units of up to that size in any typology where a dwelling unit is permitted. We would go on to define we would go on to define a separate land use, an oversized dwelling unit. This is one that allows more than 4, but up to 8 bedrooms, no more than 8. And we would further limit such units, oversized dwelling units, to detached dwellings only. And that's in recognition that, of course, households needing that many bedrooms do exist, but it's not desirable from a planning standpoint to allow multiple such units to be stacked on top of one another. Okay. The second major change we're proposing is really in clarifying the difference between dwelling units and rooming houses. It's a question that has been pursued in court many times by various municipalities facing issues that are fairly similar to the one we face here. What we've found from the case law, the thing that stands up as the robust distinction between whether it's a rooming house or whether it's a dwelling unit occupied by a group of roommates, is whether it's occupied by a household, a single housekeeping unit, in which case it's a dwelling unit, versus a collection of individuals renting directly from the landlord. the notion that the household is a group of people who come together, who occupy as a unit. They often will have the same lease. They will all be on the same lease. They'll be there for the same period. They will be responsible for each other as part of the rent. If one of the roommates leaves in the middle of the term, it is the remainder of the household that chooses the new roommate. It's the remainder of the household that is responsible for paying that person's share of the rent if they can't find one. That's a household. As distinct from, in the case of a rooming house, you may have a building that is physically identical, but the individuals renting the rooms, they've all rented them directly from the landlord. They may not even know the names of the people living in the other units, and they're certainly not beholden to them in any way. This is a distinction that it is the one that has consistently been upheld in the various cases of this nature. So we're proposing to amend the definitions of rooming house and dwelling unit to align with that established robust distinction. And again, when we talk about a household, it's important to underscore it makes no difference whether the people are related or not. It makes no difference whether they are renting or not. A household, it can be a single housekeeping establishment that is a family, and there's several examples of families that might constitute a household here. But it also means a group of people who, again, live together as a single housekeeping unit. They don't have to be related. They may have come together and rented the unit. But again, the key distinction is that they are living together as a household in the manner that I've described earlier, not individuals renting rooms directly from the landlord. And here, I'm not going to go into detail about what the details and the distinctions are. This is here in case there's any questions later, so we can come back to it. But again, in the case of a household, they are collectively responsible for the inside of the unit, whereas in the case of a rooming house, not so much. Here's a table where we lay out kind of visually what the distinctions would be. Again, the key distinction being whether it's a household or not a household. If it's a household if it's a household occupying a unit with up to 4 bedrooms, that's considered a dwelling unit. If it's a household that occupies a unit that has more than 5 bedrooms but no more than 8 bedrooms, we call it an oversized dwelling unit, and we permit that only in a detached dwelling. In all other cases, it's considered a rooming house. And that gives us great clarity for when we find units that may have been built or permitted one way, but then end up operating a different way. It makes it clear from the beginning so that everybody knows what they're getting into. The third major change in this amendment proposal is zoning requirements for garbage management. Again, when we're into a building that has 6 or more units, site plan control kicks in. There are standards for solid waste, containerized collection. Those sorts of buildings haven't posed garbage problems as long as they're going through site plan and the solid waste standards. It's the large buildings that are often too small to go through site plan control, that don't get caught by that discretionary approval, but that may in fact be very large, and whether they are intended to from the beginning or not, often end up having much higher occupancies than was originally intended, and commensurate increase in the amount of garbage and the challenges in dealing with that garbage in a responsible way. So this zoning requirement would apply to those buildings with 3 to 6 units, those that otherwise don't get hit by the site plan control measures that control for garbage. We would require, regardless of what the side yard is, we'd require a minimum 1.2 meter, 4-foot wide clear access from the rear yard to the curb. And that's to make sure that there is the physical opportunity to move garbage from the back and out to the street, no matter what happens to the building in the future. Once you've built the building and you've got the footprint, most of your opportunities to improve the management of the site are now locked in. So you need to do that from the beginning. We would also provide that, and that's for buildings with over 400 square meters in total floor area. That's everything inside the building envelope. And then furthermore, when you have such a building that proposes between 3 and 6 units, again, more than 6 units, you get caught by site plan control. We would also include a requirement in the zoning for an indoor garbage storage area. And when we say indoor, we mean either in the main building or in an accessory building. It's not something that's just fenced in. It has to be something with a roof. And that, we think, will appropriately ensure a reasonable degree of garbage management in a building, even if its use and occupancy changes once the permit's been issued. We want it to be clear, notwithstanding the name of the project, R4 zoning, we have been clear from the very beginning of this, from the initial email notification that was sent out to all community groups, as well as some known industry participants that would be interested. We've been clear that this change is not restricted to the R4 zones. It also has implications largely throughout the inner urban area, particularly the residential zones, particularly R4 and R3. But by making these changes to the definitions, this amendment will have effect citywide. And we've been clear about this from the beginning, and we've reaffirmed this many times throughout our consultation, going back to the beginning of 2016. There's also, the last recommendation is to extend the interim control bylaws that were adopted last summer, applicable to, well, I'll show you the map in a moment, but applicable to Sandy Hill, Overbrook, the Glebe, Old Ottawa South. We'd like to request that those interim control bylaws be extended for 1 more year for several reasons. One is to allow the implementation and monitoring, see how the results of this phase 1 go. To allow the second phase of work that still needs to be done to be carried out, and to allow time for the harmonization of other bylaws that affect how all of this will be implemented: site plan control, rooming house bylaw, development charges, etc. So as we said, this is phase 1. This is the first part. This is mainly about closing the existing gaps in the existing zoning that have allowed these undesirable situations to arise. But there's a whole other body of work that needs to happen. We'll be looking at some of the more fundamental planning issues that help to contribute to this, the pressures that created this so-called bunkhouse issue in the first place. Clearly there's a demand for housing in the inner urban area, and we need to make sure that our zoning responds intelligently to that demand and doesn't encourage people to find loopholes and do the wrong thing. So several things foreseen for the next year. We're going to carry out a review of what we call missing middle low-rise housing typologies. Low-rise apartments, things more than 3 units, maybe up to 12 units, something of that nature. To look at things like the unit caps that apply in various zones, look at the performance standards that are necessary to make such buildings work, especially given the lot fabric that we have. There'll be work on design guidelines and standards to ensure the compatibility of new multi-unit buildings, to make sure that they fit in better with the neighborhood in ways that haven't already been looked at in Infill 1 and Infill 2. And again, we would examine things like the development charges bylaw, the cash in lieu of parkland bylaw, site plan control. All of these bylaws, while being designed to do certain things, in some cases have the effect, unintended effect, of encouraging people to produce a smaller number of very large units that then leads to the problem we have. So again, this is not just a zoning issue. There's no such thing as just a zoning problem. We want to make sure that we aren't working in silos and that we work in concert with all of the other bylaws that need to be reviewed. Here are the boundaries of the current interim control bylaws we'll be asking to be extended. These are the black lines in the middle. The color is all the R1, R2, R3, R4 zones in the inner urban area. So finally, the recommendations. The limit on bedroom counts and dwelling units, whereas there's currently no such limit. Amend the definition of a rooming house to remove the gray area, remove the ambiguity, and make it much easier to carry out enforcement when something that's operating as a rooming house is found. Set the minimum garbage storage requirements for big buildings in the zoning. Changing other citywide definitions, just sort of technical stuff to make sure that the intent of all this comes through. And finally, recommending the extension of the interim control bylaw for another calendar year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have Councillor Hubley on the list for questions. If anybody else has questions on either ARAC or planning, but we do have speakers, so I'm going to go with the speakers first. So hold your questions, write them down, okay? Thank you for the presentation. It's a very technical subject, and I think you did a great job of demystifying it, or making it worse, depending on how much you knew when you started. First up is Paul Weber. Paul, are you here? I see you. Welcome. You have 5 minutes. Yep, we won't start until you open your mouth. We'll even let you turn the mic on first. That's on, right? Oh, bonus.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of council. This is my third time around to speak to you about 203-205 Henderson. I don't want to spend much time in the history because we've had our hearing before the tribunal. We're expecting a decision, and if that comes in favorably, we'll be putting up 22 units in accordance with our approved site plan. However, we've been trying to find a way to settle, to keep both sides happy, and in reviewing the bylaw, or the proposed bylaw before you, there are a couple of changes that weren't mentioned that are important. First of all, secondary units are still allowed. So when the little sketch went up with one dwelling unit on each side of a semi, that's not correct. You're allowed one dwelling unit, primary unit, and one secondary unit on each side of a semi. The staff tells me that's 4 bedrooms each, so that's 16 instead of 22. We could live with that, and we're prepared to. We already have site plan approval. I mean, it was scandalous that we were put in the first bylaw when 70 Russell was left out, but enough of that. As of right, we would be allowed 16 units, subject to revising the site plan. Now, the second thing that was very unclear to me, it's at page 85 of my copy of the report, and the question is, will the 120 square meter limit on unit floor area be included in the proposed zoning amendment, i.e. the floor area currently imposed through interim control bylaw? I didn't understand the answer. It says the proposed zoning amendment does not include a limit on the unit floor area. So that 120 meters squared is out. However, the floor area limit was appropriate for an interim control bylaw designed to temporarily stop certain kinds of development when a more comprehensive study could be completed. Through this review, it was determined that a 120 square meter limit on floor area would be counterproductive, discouraging family-size units as well as rendering many existing and legitimate dwelling units non-compliant with respect to the zoning. I inquired of the staff as to is it in or is it out. The reply I've received from Mr. Mark was without prejudice.
Madam Chair, that inquiry was without prejudice to both sides.
Yeah, as I just said, the inquiry from the response from Mr. Mark was without prejudice, so I cannot get into it, but you probably want to ask him that question. I'll leave you with a hypothetical. If the 120 meters is counterproductive, and if it is only remaining in force because you're renewing the interim control bylaw, then I would ask that you exempt 2035 Henderson from the interim control bylaw with respect to that parameter and allow us to proceed with the development. Finally, I'd ask you to realize that all of this discussion is enormously perplexing because there's an elephant in the room, and that's the student population. There are 35,000 undergraduate students at the U of O, of which there are 3,000 beds provided on campus. So either we're stacking them 11 deep, or 32,000 have to be accommodated in the community. It's an elephant. And staff can say, well, we're not focusing on students. Who do you think is going to occupy a dwelling unit opposite a residence, right on the other side of Anderson Avenue? I mean, it's ridiculous to talk about generalities. This is all about student housing. Then they say, well, it's not affordable. The prices are too high. Good, build more and make it affordable. But focus on what the real problem is, and the real problem is those 32,000 students who have to be accommodated. Sure, lots of them are living at home in mom and dad's basement. They're Ottawa kids, but a lot aren't, and that's the pressure that's on you. When the next council comes to adopt affordable housing policies, because it's now required in the Planning Act, you'll have the same debate over and over again. Where are we going to put these people in a safe and healthy accommodation? We can build one that meets all of the requirements that the staff have now come up with, save and except that one hiccup that they're carrying something forward. They may be carrying something forward in the interim control bylaw from which we should be exempted. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. Anyone have any questions for Mr. Weber? Nope. Thank you very much for coming out again. Next up, we have Linda Gamma Pinto, who's with the Heron Park Community Association. Welcome. Have you been here before?
No, this is my first time. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. And so you have 5 minutes to speak, and you've got the mic on, and there you go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We reviewed the report. Some of the quotes from the report: close the door on excessive buildings, excessive bedroom buildings, prohibit further development of dwelling units with unreasonably large bedroom counts. Dwelling units with 6, 8, or even 12 bedrooms have occurred, much higher densities than was intended or anticipated by the zoning. Inappropriate development, not what the official plan intended to occur for established communities. The review also goes on to talk about some of the consequences, the negative consequences of garbage, noise, parking, but doesn't actually speak to the erosion of that ineffable quality of communities such as neighborhood, livability, and quality of life. Heron Park and other communities in the urban core have been deeply affected by investors purchasing and converting single-family homes to 6 and 8 bedroom bunkhouses, and also adding on to existing multi-unit dwellings, creating 6 or more units in 6 or more units in these R3 zones. Generally, Heron Park Community Association is very supportive of the definitions for dwelling unit, for the new refined definitions for rooming house, for the limits to 4 bedrooms and multi-dwelling buildings, and even the definition for single-unit households. We, however, disagree with giving a pass to bunkhouses by calling them oversized dwelling units. The review detailed the harms of this typology. Why make it more difficult to control by now making it a permitted use? Rules should be made to limit the offense, not to accommodate the exceptions. The evidence used to justify the 8 bedrooms for the oversized dwelling unit is from the census, the 2011 census. The census identifies this rare group of 3% of all households, but the census talks about family and non-family households. However, we are limited by precluding the word family, thereby opening the door for the current situation. The challenge with this definition of single housekeeping unit is too easy to fake. I'll speak about the issues around enforcement a little later. The rents for these converted homes are too high for families. We have over a dozen of these bunkhouses in Heron Park. Not one is occupied by a family of any size. More than half of my executive come from families of 6, 8, and 10, from all over Canada, and even raised in Heron Park. All were raised in 3 and 4 bedroom homes. So it really goes to the question of the need. We have supported variances in our neighborhood where there's been a request for a family seeking to enlarge their home, but this went through building permits, and there is a process for that, and we think that that's probably sufficient. The proposed amendment the proposed amendments have been constructed to limit unreasonably large bedroom counts. And we feel it will be more effective at achieving its goals without the exemption for this oversized dwelling unit. Enforcement is always a challenge. The resources are already scarce. Either a dwelling is a rooming house or it's a dwelling unit. Why complicate the issue by having oversized dwelling units and having the neighbors having to prove or force the onus on the residents? As our colleagues indicated, the issue is the number of bedrooms, not households. It's the number of bedrooms. So let's focus on the number of bedrooms. Let's not interfere with the living arrangements of people. Keep the bedroom count limited to the dwelling unit. So, in conclusion, it is our view that this proposal will be stronger, clearer, and achieve its stated goals more directly if it does not include the creation of this chimera of the oversized dwelling unit. The zoning amendments proposals will work without this unnecessary exemption. Where families need extra room and extra bedrooms, as with any change to a home, a building permit is required, and that should be sufficient oversight.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Well said. Any questions for Ms. Gamma-Pinto? Councillor Shirelli has a question for you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just wondering if you realize that this is the first time there actually will be a room limit placed on construction.
Yes, and we're very supportive of it. That's what we think is unique and will be very helpful certainly for the neighborhoods that are affected.
Okay, and secondly, I'm wondering if you understand that the enforcement issues have very little to do with the amount of resources that we give bylaw enforcement. It's more to do with the ability to gather evidence to make charges stick because of various legalities.
Absolutely, and that's the issue to us. That's the challenge, is that with this definition of a single household keeping unit, the ability to gather that information is going to force dishonesty. So why create the opportunity or force people to lie about their situations when you don't need to by just having the limit? Either it's as the diagram showed, either it's a dwelling unit with 4 bedrooms or it is a rooming house.
Yeah.
There's no need to have an exception in the bylaw.
He's here. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Brian Casagrande from FOTAN. As soon as we have all the speakers have spoken, we've got a group of motions that we'll table from a variety of people, and then we'll go to questions after that, and I am taking names. Welcome, Mr. Casagrande.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of committee. Brian Casagrande with FOTAN Consultants. I am here today representing the Greater Ottawa Home Builders Association, also known as GOBA. GOBA has a small committee of a number of members that are particularly interested in urban infill and appropriately called the Urban Infill Committee. I attend those meetings from time to time, and on that basis they asked me to come today to speak to the committee on their behalf. The primary reason why I'm in front of you is because I really want to thank staff, in particular Mr. Wise, for their approach to this particular initiative. It was a very collaborative effort. Mr. Wise went to their meetings several times, was available constantly for questions and comments, and principally at the end of the day, I think what you have before you is a document that is broadly accepted by the industry based on the fact that together the two parties could work to share their mutual interests and their collective experience in dealing with an issue that I think all have interest in and all have experience in. So once again, we'd like to thank Mr. Wise and the City of Ottawa staff, and we hope that this actually can serve as a good template for future initiatives such as the second phase of this one and other ones that are likely coming down the pipe consistently, such as the official plan that's on the horizon. So once again, we thank staff for their efforts.
Thanks very much, and thank you for taking the time to come out and thank staff. I know that a lot of time has gone into this, and I know that several of our councillors were part of a sponsor group as well, that Mr. Willis thought that was important to bring that into, and I think that working together it really made a difference. So thanks very much for saying that.
My pleasure.
Okay, so our next speaker is Brent Webster. He's from the Bel Air Community Association. Welcome, sir. You have 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, council members, I'm a board member with the Bel Air Community Association, so we're directly affected by this R4. We're just down the street from Algonquin College. We're basically 98% single-family homes that are being bought up by Toronto speculators. Place beside me has been turned into a 2-unit rental unit. We've got places up the road that have been converted into rooming houses, where the front lawns have now turned into mud pits because of parking. There's, again, you can drive around the whole neighborhood and tell who the rental units are because they're not being taken care of with respect to the front lawn, the no mowing, no gardens, just looks like a pigsty. We want to take back our community. We spent a lot of money on our homes, and we're expecting a little bit of respect. The problem is now most of the homeowners of these rental units don't live in them, and we have very little recourse. I'll go to my next door neighbor and ask who's going to mow his lawn, and he's going, maybe I should, but I don't have a lawnmower. Right, and I'm a renter, so what's the expectations there? So we really need this basically limiting to 4 bedrooms. We've even got marketing now with respect to RE/MAX and that are selling the homes in our area classified as 3+3. So basically they're hoping for the 3-bedroom rentals in the basement. We're also getting Airbnbs. We've got an Airbnb around the neighborhood where the basement is a rental unit and the upstairs is an Airbnb. We're running into parking issues again because a lot of our driveways are just one single lane. If you've got multiple people in it, either they're playing basically free-for-all trying to adjust the cars, or they're parking on the road. So anyhow, just in short, I totally agree with this 4-bedroom limit on dwelling units. Again, I'm not a big fan of the oversize. Again, it's a bit of confusion with respect to where we can kind of draw the line. I'd rather just have either it's 4-bedroom dwelling unit or rooming house, and that's it. That's my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Councillor Shirelli has a question for you.
Yeah. I just want to make sure you realize that with this, assuming it passes, and that the amendments pass, we will retain the right to rent out only up to 3 bedrooms in a house. So it's actually going to be lower than 4 for our area, because I know the area you're talking about. And for the first time ever, there will be a limit in the number of rooms you can build. So I look at this, when we look at the problem in Bel Air, Cityview, Crestview, Centerpoint, and Ryan Farm, I think this is a 2-step process. Today is the first step using the zoning tool, and then we have a second step with the report that will be coming possibly in the fall on Airbnb and on residential room rental bylaw. So just want to make sure you'll be up for the fight at that.
I'll be there.
Good.
Are your neighbors making the call to bylaw about the parking on the street beyond 3 hours?
I've mentioned it to them, so it's just a matter of making sure, as they just got the new people moving into the basement, so at least it's 2 families. So I was a little worried that it was going to turn more into a rental unit, but at least it's 2 families. But they'll still be jockeying for positions and whatever for parking, and like I said, they still don't have a clue who's going to take care of the lawn, type thing. So I mean, for us, it's a lot about presentation. We put a lot of effort into our lawns and our gardens, etc.
Yeah. Okay, we'll see what we can do about that beyond what we're talking about here today. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Susan D. Smith, architect. Susan, welcome. Welcome, Susan. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I won't take that long, councillors. As an architect, I just wanted to emphasize the need for some kind of a transition clause in bylaws in general. We work very hard designing, sometimes years and months, projects, and we explain to our clients what they can build on the property, and then to suddenly have it changed when we're just about to get the building permit, it's really unfair for the owners, the contractors that are lined up to build the project, and for the architects that have been putting their work into, so much their heart into the work. And I'd like to also reiterate Paul Weber's comment about there is a need for student housing, so how will that be addressed? And I appreciate that they'll be looking at the other bylaws, because for these smaller builders, the costs of development for the full site plan control process are often prohibitive.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing up a couple more points. Does anyone have any questions for Ms. Smith? Thank you for coming out. So that's all the delegations I have that have signed up to speak. I have Councillor Hughley, Tierney, McKenney. Anyone else have questions? Leeper, okay, Kadri, Nussbaum. I'm sure will be more. Go ahead, Councillor Hughley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple things I want to clarify here. Can you go back to the chart where you're showing that what you're allowing in a semi and what you allow in a detached? We have situations in my ward, I'm assuming the other suburban councillors would have the same, for example, family with 6 kids in a semi-detached. Does this bylaw impact them?
Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, yes, it would. If they have more than 4 bedrooms within a semi-detached, yes, it would. Now, if they have an existing semi-detached that is currently right there right now, they would be legally non-compliant. Certainly, no one's showing up with a bulldozer tomorrow. But they'll have that protection. Going forward, they would be limited to that 4-bedroom cap, absolutely.
And so in cases, again, in my ward, I know it exists. It exists elsewhere. We have senior citizens that living on fixed incomes, and what they tend to do is turn their basements into an apartment, or they move into the basement and turn the upstairs into an apartment, and they would fall into this category because often these semis and detached will get up into the 6-bedroom range. So again, you're impacting them.
Chairs, -S, that would be a different situation. I think what you're talking about there would be a secondary dwelling unit. So secondary dwelling units are permitted within a detached, within semi-detached. So if someone wanted to do a conversion, so if they have a detached home and they wanted to put in a secondary dwelling unit, that would be permitted. There's no concern with that. So that situation there, that would be acceptable.
So they would have to get their basement or the upstairs, whatever, declared as a secondary dwelling.
Yeah, that would be standard.
And we're going to take them through one of our planning processes.
Well, it would depend. If they're in a semi-detached right now, if they have a 4-bedroom semi-detached and they wish to convert themselves into they wanted to put in an independent basement apartment in the bottom and then rent out the top, yes, they should be declaring themselves as a secondary dwelling unit, and they should be adhering to the building code with respect to that. As they currently, and that's not a change. That is the current rules as well too.
Okay, and then the ones that existed before amalgamation are just grandfathered into this, I take it, because they're not secondaries.
That's correct.
So, Madam Chair, I'm going to ask to put a motion forward to exempt Canada from this. I'm not doing this to families and tell them they can only have 4 kids. I'm not on for that. This issue involves around schools, where you have the student housing, as the other delegates have mentioned. It does not involve the suburban, at least you'll speak for your own suburb, but in my suburb, I'm not telling people that there's a cap on how many kids they can have. So, I'm out.
Mr. Mark, this is a citywide policy. Have you commented on excluding Canada, I guess, or maybe Canada South?
It's also not a fertility motion.
I'm asking Mr. Mark.
Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, it is not immediately apparent to me what would be the planning basis for treating a particular suburban ward differently from other wards with respect to this bylaw.
But now you're saying suburban, and then this is something that we're looking at. There's a reason why the Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee is having a concurrent meeting with the Planning Committee today, because it's a citywide item, policy, correct?
Yes, Madam Chair. Mr.
So
Chair.
I remember when we first were amalgamated that we made exceptions for Rockcliffe for far too long. All the taxpayers used to pay to leaf blow their properties, for example. And so, who's leaf cycle, not a blower? So so if Councillor Hughley moves a motion to exclude Canada South, that's what I'm asking to comment on a citywide policy.
Madam Chair, I could go further. I don't see at this time any rationale to treat one ward differently from the other 22.
Okay, but there's nothing to stop them from doing it.
It's within the jurisdiction of committees to recommend this to council, yes.
There you go.
Look, Madam Chair, I'm comfortable if yourself and the other suburban councillors don't see a concern with this and don't want to protect the families that choose to have more than 4 kids, then that's fine. I'll just vote against this.
But that's,
if you don't want to go down the road of an
that's
exemption.
not about, because don't forget we have the opportunity for the 8-bed, Mr. Wise, you want 8 bedrooms for situations where you have families that have larger numbers of family members. And also, I don't know in your presentation whether you spoke to the next step, the next phase of this process of the R4, but maybe you want to talk to those two things together.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. There are going to be situations out there, absolutely, where you're going to have large households. That is without doubt. And in fact, that is actually that is the reason why the oversized dwelling unit category actually exists, and why we think it is so important to have that. We are making it very clear within the zoning bylaw that we think, as of right, having more than 4 bedrooms in a semi-detached and a multi-unit typology, there better be a really good reason for it. So we know that there are a number of developments in the urban. We know that there are developments in the suburban area where someone might have 5 or they might have 6 bedrooms as are proposed within their development. That's fine. When you are moving through with a new development, all you need to do at the time is be very clear and very open with we're doing and seek the appropriate zoning to allow for that oversized dwelling unit to occur. If you have that zoning permission, you can go ahead and you can build an oversized dwelling unit in semi-detached, in a triplex, in an apartment building, if you have that land use permission. And so we're making that very clear that it is a principal land use. There is a clear rationale for what this is intended for, and you need to make sure that you are being upfront with what it is that you are doing. Again, we believe that it makes a lot of sense to allow an oversized dwelling unit to occur as of right within a detached home. We know that there are a number of buildings across the way, and certainly new typologies occurring in the suburban area, Barrhaven, Canada, Orleans, and also inside the Greenbelt as well too, where 5 or 6 bedrooms are not common. And so certainly we don't want to have a situation where we suddenly render most of the detached homes within across the city as being legally non-conforming or non-complying as well too. That would be a bit of an absurd situation. But there is a path that is available through this zoning, an application, but it is also an upfront application that one would need to make in order to allow for something with more than 4 bedrooms to occur in a multi-unit typology.
Thank you. Where am I on the list here? Councillor Tierney, McKenney, Leeper, Kadri, Nussbaum, Blake.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just a couple of questions, because I've run into this before about secondary dwelling units, accessory addressing, all that great fun. When it came to the zones, have we looked at all parts of the city again? For example, when I came into office, on the Ottawa side of the tracks, you were capped at 8 meters for development, and then you moved to the Gloucester side of the tracks. My predecessor never harmonized with the City of Ottawa and allowed right up to 11 meter, which I've since changed. But we've seen these duplexes with the secondary dwelling unit going in, just from spot zoning through the city within the urban boundary. Have we looked at that in depth and make sure that they're all kind of harmonized as well?
With respect to secondary dwelling units, no, we haven't gone through a detailed review of where secondary dwelling units are or are not permitted all the way through. Yeah, that's what I thought. We did make a provision and a change. I'm not sure how many years ago. Tim would be able to answer a little bit better, but we did provide a cutoff point for when secondary dwelling units would be allowed to occur within duplex typologies. So if you look in, and again, I don't have the bylaw in front of me, but within section 133, Madam and Mr. Chair, there is a prohibition there that states, as of a certain date, secondary dwelling units will only be permitted within certain duplexes. We do think that we do need to have a look at section 133 as part of phase 2. That is also one of the things that we would like to have a look at and have a look and see how those secondary dwelling units are being worked out and rolled out in ongoing. And so we would like to take a little bit more of a more detailed look at what the intent of the secondary dwelling unit policies are then, but incorporate that as part of our phase 2 work.
Great, and just as a follow-up, of course, I've seen also where, people have used our own rules against us. They built a corner lot. When it comes to accessory addressing, have we looked at that aspect of things as well? And just to define, where people can have 2 addresses on 2 separate streets because it's a corner lot. Have we looked at those aspects?
Madam and Mr. Chair, that would have been beyond the scope of this project.
Fair enough. Yeah. Great, thank you.
That's interesting. Councillor McKenney?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, staff, for the report. I know it's been a long and complicated path, and we've met several times on it. My issues, obviously, are around rooming houses. The ward I represent has got the highest number of rooming houses in it, and while they provide affordability for many people and are an absolute requirement for the spectrum of housing, 2 issues. One is unregulated rooming houses. I've been to many, both unregulated and regulated. And while most regulated rooming houses function well, the ones that don't are, border on inhumane conditions for living in, and certainly the unregulated ones do as well. So I guess, with bylaw services, we were able to get a dedicated bylaw officer for rooming houses. And while that works somewhat, but there's a lot of rooming houses to visit those rooming houses, it's the unregulated ones that are the problem. And what I
while I like this, I think that it does give us a better definition of what a rooming house is. It just is not clear to me how we're going to determine what a household unit is. What would it look like? Take me through a visit to an unregulated rooming house. I was at one the other day. I'll give you an example. I won't say where, but it was 3 bedrooms. It was a semi-detached. Had 3 bedrooms. It was absolutely a rooming house. They were not a unit. But how would you be able to determine that? And it's very difficult to get in. Many of the folks won't tell on their landlord. They have nowhere else to go. They pay quite a bit of money, matter of fact, for these rooms, but there's no other affordable housing available to them. It's that or the shelter. So I'm just wondering, in concrete terms, how would we be able to determine that a 3-bedroom semi-detached or a 5-bedroom home is actually a rooming house where there's no household unit?
So Madam and Mr. Chair, I'm going to obfuscate a little bit, so my apologies. And the reason I'm going to obfuscate about this is because obviously I'm in policy planning. And so what we're doing, and one of the things that I was up front about in the beginning of our presentation to Planning Committee and Agricultural Rural Affairs Committee, is that what we're doing within the zoning bylaw is working with these other branches of the city to make sure that we have the structural underpinnings so that they can do their job more effectively. So certainly we know that within the zoning issue, a big challenge that bylaw enforcement was having was their ability to go to one of these places, these unregulated rooming houses, and understand, is it a dwelling unit, is it a rooming house, what is it? And the zoning bylaw was getting in the way. So that was a challenge. So this is all about how do we make sure that the zoning bylaw can get out of the way, and so that they may have the ability to do what they need to do. They're going to be coming through with their own report to Environmental Protective Services with respect to how do you differentiate what a rooming house might be. But certainly with respect to, if Jake were here, I don't know if Mr. Gravel is here today or Mr. Chapman, and I certainly don't want to speak for them, but they would always say that they need to collect the evidence as the officer sees it and moves forward with that evidence. We have provided in conjunction with them what we feel would be reasonable tests for when you would be looking at something, and that's just on the screen for you there, as to when something would be a dwelling unit, a household, versus when something would be more in the category of a rooming house. And again, it relies on the collection of evidence that bylaw would have to go through, and then that would of course need to go through its own jurisdiction process as well too. Again, what we want to do is we want to provide that clarity so that the zoning bylaw is out of the way. It's now crystal clear. Okay, if you walk into a situation here and you have unrelated adults that are renting individually, that are signing separate leases, where a landlord is swapping one in and out on a regular basis, where there's no accountability or communal accountability for such situations. These things all stack together to allow bylaw to collect the evidence to say, okay, under the bylaws and under the definitions that we have, it doesn't look as if you're a household. It looks more like you're something else. And then that gives them the ability to then move forward with more confidence. This won't be a magic bullet. This won't be an immediate process where we can look at something and immediately pinpoint this and this and this and this. It will still be a process, an ongoing process. But again, what we want to do with this particular amendment is make sure that the zoning bylaw itself is not part of the problem.
Thank you. And I agree that you have achieved that with this bylaw. And I know it's not necessarily the right place to bring it up, but I need to be on record as saying I don't believe that that bylaw has the resources to actually implement the bylaw, to actually be able to go to unregulated rooming houses and gather the evidence that's required to understand whether people are living within one, a household unit, how they're sharing a kitchen, how they're paying their rent. So, while I do realize it's out of scope here, I do just want to put it on public record that it will require more resources. But people are living in dire circumstances. I was in a unregulated rooming house the other day without fire alarm, smoke alarms, without a light in the hallway. It is unbearable conditions that landlords are getting away with. And I want to just put it on record for here that we will need resources to be able to do this properly. But what you've done is a good step.
It won't come from them, and that's something.
No, I realize that.
And that what we should do, though, is remember this for discussion for the budget.
Yes.
And the fall, I mean, and for governance a little bit too, eh? Because,
absolutely.
I mean, what some of the things you were talking about and how you're going to find that out, I mean, people won't even let police come into their house, you know, without a search warrant. So, I mean, it's not like we're going to have special powers to do that.
I agree.
I think it's a whole other discussion.
I agree.
And we'll leave it to staff to take that away and figure out which departments need to be involved in it.
Yes.
So I'm just going to be mindful before I ask Councillor Chiarelli to introduce his motion and we introduce the other two technical ones, that we have a lot of people here to speak today. We have the Ottawa Hospital, we have Roosevelt Avenue, we have McRae Avenue and Tweedsmuir. We have, and then we have that inquiry that's listed. So I'm just asking to be mindful of that. You want to move your motion? And then I'm going to Councillor Leeper.
Okay. I'll move my motion, but can I just do a follow-up question to the city solicitor on
yes,
that?
Sure.
Okay. Yes, on the makeup and characteristics of the independent housing unit, or whatever we're calling it at this point, isn't it accurate that if we give the general characteristics in this bylaw, we don't need to get them all, because in the end, isn't it a finding of fact by the judge that determines whether it in fact exists that way?
Yes, Madam Chair, a justice of the peace or a judge will take the definition and he or she will apply the facts as they're determined to the wording that is before him or her.
Okay. Because I'm aware when the Catholic School Board established its development charges bylaw, just put the words independent dwelling unit and always left it up to the judge or the JP. Anyway, okay, so the motion is moved by myself, whereas the report recommends zoning changes to ensure a clearer zoning distinction between a rooming house and a dwelling unit or oversized dwelling unit. And whereas the intent of the current and proposed zoning is to allow the principal resident of a dwelling unit or oversized unit, in the case of the proposed zoning, to take no more than 3 roomers or boarders without the unit being treated as a rooming house under the zoning. And whereas there is an opportunity to further clarify the intent that any unit where more than 3 roomers or boarders are housed constitutes a rooming house under the zoning. And whereas Bylaw and Regulatory Services is in the process of reviewing definitions in the licensing bylaw as it relates to rooming houses, and it is desirable to harmonize the regulation of rooming houses by the zoning bylaw and licensing bylaw. Therefore, be it resolved that Planning Committee recommend Council approve the following change be made to the staff report. The document 2, details of the recommended zoning. Recommendation 1H be amended to delete the proposed definition of rooming house and replacing it with the following. Rooming house means a residential unit other than a group home, retirement home, or converted retirement home that I is not used or intended for use as a residential premise by the household, or II is used or intended for use as a residential premises by a household and more than 3 roomers or boarders, or III contains more than 8 bedrooms. And be it further resolved that Planning Committee requests that Bylaw and Regulatory Services considers using the same definitions of bedroom, detached dwelling, dwelling unit, household, oversized dwelling unit, residential unit, rooming house, and rooming unit as part of its review and report, where doing so is practical and will maximize the opportunities to align the intent and licensing bylaws. And be it further resolved that there be no further notice pursuant to subsection 3417 of the Planning Act. So.
Okay, so just introduce it. Okay, and then Councillor, Vice Chair Tierney has 2 to introduce. One's technical and one's not.
Great, thank you, Madam Chair. I'll start with the technical motion first. Therefore, be it resolved that the Planning Committee recommend Council approve the following changes be made to the staff report. That document 2, recommendation 4, be amended as follows. 1, by amending the proposed 132.2 by adding the words existing as of January 1st, 2018 between the words despite 1, comma, 2 rooming houses and the words are permitting in building, and number 2, by deleting the proposed 132-7 and replacing it with the following, despite 161.5 and 122.1 were permitted in the R1, R2, R3, R4 through the R411 zones, and building containing a rooming house is subject to the height, yard, lot width, lot area requirements of the detached dwelling, and where such building occupancies are more than one lot, such a lot are to be considered one lot for the zoning purposes. Be it further resolved that there's no further notices pursuant to the subsection 3417 of the Planning Act. That's clear.
But you have another.
Yeah, that's the first one. Take 2. This one's substantially easier. Whereas the report from the planning staff include the recommendations to the Committee of Adjustment with respect to their interpretation of the Planning Act tests for approved minor variances, whereas the interpretation of the Planning Act tests should be made based on the specifics of such application, independent and general by the City Council. Therefore, be resolved that the planning staff be directed to remove the following wording from the staff report prior to this matter rising to Council. All other things being equal, applications that seek many variances should be treated as less minor than those seeking fewer variances, even if the individual variances are each minor to themselves. The committee should use its own judgment in determining whether a set of variances together exceeds the threshold of a minor variance. However, the committee is reminded that the minor zoning process with more thorough public notification and consultation exists for changing multiple zones, standard application to a site.
Well, thank you for coming back to read those. I have a question, Mr. Mark, is he here? So, on the motions that have just been tabled, only the Planning Committee votes on those motions, or should both ARAC and Planning vote on them?
Madam Chair, both are legally acceptable. What staff had recommended is that they be voted on only by Planning Committee.
And it's only Planning members that have moved them, too.
Yes, that's what both are legal, but staff had easier if it was just Planning Committee that voted on.
That's what Chair Moffat and I thought as well.
Concur.
He concurs. Thank you. Where am I? Councillor Leeper, Kadri, Nussbaum, Blais, Hughley again. So if anybody would like to get off of the list, just like wave at me and I'll be real happy.
What do we get for your happiness? What do we get for your happiness? What do we get for your happiness?
I'll buy you pizza.
I'm on your list, I'm first.
Don't jump on just because you might get pizza.
Thanks, Chair. A couple of quick questions. First, just if legal or staff could help me understand what are fundamentally the implications of Councillor Chiarelli's motion and the second of Councillor Tierney's motion. And I'm also wondering, Chair, can we get prints of all three of those motions distributed, please? So first question, and do you support those motions?
Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, yes, we do. The implications of Councillor Chiarelli's motion is simply to add an extra degree of clarity to the definitions, and in particular when someone is trying to determine whether something is a rooming house or not a rooming house. Okay. It's just stronger wording.
Have anyone had a chance to chat with bylaw about that and how that's going to dovetail with their review?
We have spoken to them, and they're fully apprised of it, and they're okay with it.
Okay, and the second of Councillor Tierney's motions?
The second of Councillor Tierney is having to do with the wording in the report.
Yeah, Committee of Adjustment.
That's to fix a loophole we noticed just as we were going through and just making sure that we had all the proper type
language proper. So that was just really to correct a technical an issue that we noticed in the bylaw before we brought it to planning committee.
And staff support that.
Staff supports that.
Wonderful, thank you. You had two. I think the first one was also technical.
The other one was purely technical.
Yeah, the other one was technical. So the question I'm coming into this with is with respect to what Ms. Gama Pinto raised and the potential for the the oversized dwelling unit to become problematic in the community. If somebody needed to accommodate 5 to 8 bedrooms. We didn't have this exception within the new R4 rules. Would they be seeking permission for that via a rezoning or via a variance?
Because the definitions are going to be very clear, this will be included within Section 54 as both a dwelling unit within Section 54. Oversized dwelling unit within Section 54. As my colleague Beth would want to say, a land use can be only one term at once. So you're either a dwelling unit or you're an oversized dwelling unit. So if someone is seeking to expand, then really what they are generally doing is they are changing the use. That being said, there is the opportunity to go before the Committee of Adjustment and make your case. For particular site-specific circumstance, you should be permitted to have more bedrooms than you might not otherwise be allowed. That would be something that the committee would be obligated to review.
Okay, so that's a C of A process, which runs usually around $6,000 or $8,000, somewhere around there.
About that.
But if that exception did not exist in the new zoning, such that the cutoff that we would allow before becoming a rooming house was 4 bedrooms, and somebody wanted 5 in a detached dwelling, would they then need to seek a rezoning, or would they need to go to the Committee of Adjustment?
If we were to go through on a site-specific basis, they could reasonably make an application to the Committee of Adjustment. Okay. It would be up to the committee to look at those tests, consider minor, consider that whether that was in fact desirable for the area, whether that was in fact planning, basically, is what the test would be, and then whether that meets the test of the zoning bylaw and the test of the official plan. Certainly in this report, staff's communication would be that we think that you need to have due diligence about that. The intent of what it is that we are trying to do is specifically to create clarity between the issue of rooming houses and dwelling units. There better be a really good reason for why you'd be coming before the Committee of Adjustment, and that would be staff's communication back to the Committee of Adjustment as well too. We need to remember the Committee of Adjustment is its own quasi-judicial. Staff can't direct them. Certainly they have the ability to formulate their own opinions and decisions, so they would look at things on their own merits, as they should. However, at the same time, if someone comes through and they have a legitimate argument for why they might need to have a 5th bedroom within their dwelling unit, and if they can make a planning argument that makes sense, that is consistent with the intent of the official plan and with the intention of the zoning bylaw, and if it's that it has indeed minor adverse impacts, it would be within the jurisdiction of the committee to consider. Where it might be interesting is if someone comes through with a Committee of Adjustment application for, say, 6, 7, or 8 bedrooms. Really, that is an oversized dwelling unit. It would be an interesting argument to see how that would unfold as to whether the committee would look at that as being within their authority, or whether they would look at that and say, that seems to be more specifically to be a land use that you have available to you. There is another statutory process that you should go through for that.
Which is a rezoning.
Yes.
So without this exception, there is the possibility that some people who may need to accommodate larger households be required then to go to a rezoning, which is obviously a pretty onerous process.
If they have a household that requires, say, 7 or 8 bedrooms in a multi-unit dwelling, yes, they would most likely need to go through some sort of a larger process.
Yeah, and a rezoning is obviously a significant cost to the applicant, not to mention time. So I am pleased to see that this exception is in here, and I'll be supporting that. One final question with respect to, I think it was Ms. Smith's delegation. What is the transition clause for this?
Yeah. Currently, right now, there is no transition clause attached to this at all. The reason there is no transition clause attached to this is because we have been signaling to the development industry for quite some time that changes were coming. They are, and the reasons for this are well known to Planning Committee and Agricultural Affairs, and also to industry as well, too, in terms of what it is that we are trying to do. The developments that are moving through with the understanding that this was coming. And certainly with the interim control bylaw, we also chose the route of no transition. And that is, when we look at what staff's proposal is right now, we are not recommending a transition provision.
So it is desirable to stop the bunkhouses without further transition?
Currently, right now, that is the intention for staff, is to focus on this issue, and we consider that 4 bedrooms in a multi-unit without just cause to be difficult to rationalize.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Kadri, Councillor Nussbaum, Councillor Blake, Councillor Hubley.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just have one question, and the question relates to today's lifestyle. Some of the extended families are moving back in with their children in their households. So how are we going to handle that where, the family's not renting or not paying rent, but they are creating other issues for the city in terms of garbage and so on? Have you looked at that, and how are we going to handle that?
That's a tricky one to answer, Madam Chair and Mr. Chair. Zoning cannot regulate based on people. We can't regulate based on the occupancy of that. We are looking at this with respect to this and saying, okay, what are the land use rationales for why we would differentiate between a household and someone that is a rooming unit? And we look at that in terms of the physical characteristics that are there. And certainly one of the things that is very clear is that a household can also be a group of unrelated people, as much as it can be a group of related people. After the fact conversions, or if someone comes to have more people living with them, that is not something that we can regulate through the zoning bylaw. We certainly can't regulate people that might be within. We can only regulate based on density. And so that is where the zoning provisions are aimed at. They're aimed at density rather than people per se. When you do have where more people are coming into a unit, maybe the bedrooms remain unchanged. Maybe they still remain at 4, but now you're putting 2 or potentially 3 people in each of those bedrooms, as an example, and they do generate extra waste. That would be areas that other nuisance bylaws would control. That would be the noise bylaw would take into consideration for that. There would also be the property standards too. And I would also argue that that might also be a provision for the waste management bylaw if those things start to really get out of hand. So I wouldn't consider those necessarily zoning issues. I would consider those more almost nuisance issues that you would use other enforcement means of the city to regulate and control.
Thank you for that, Mr. Rice, but my concern is not just about refuge. There are other issues related when, you have more than the 4 or 5 people that you're allowing in a residence. And all of a sudden you may have as extended families up to 6 or 8 or even more people moving into the household. And we're looking at and saying, well, we're not doing anything about that because obviously it's hard to maintain and it's hard to control. The concern is, related to what Councillor Hubley was saying. This is the kind of thing that's happening in suburbia. And my concern is, again, if we're controlling, let's call it the student population in the urban core, why are we not looking at these kind of one-off situations or even more than one-off situations in the suburban area?
So I just want to make just one correction, Madam Chair. This issue is not focused on the student population, and I want to make that absolutely crystal clear. I do agree with my colleagues, Ms. Smith and Mr. Weber, that we do have a very significant concern with respect to those student populations and the off-campus housing. Absolutely. We need to find ways to provide for those student populations. We need to find ways for them to be there. But the question would be, in what manner are we going to house them? Are we going to make sure that they're housed in a licensed and safe environment that is up to building code? Or are we going to allow them to continue to be housed in an unregulated and unlicensed manner? But certainly this is not aimed at limiting student populations whatsoever.
Well, it's not aimed at limiting families.
That's right.
Yeah. Anything else, Councillor Caddy?
Thank you very much.
And that's where you're hearing now from 2 suburban councillors, and their issues are not about the student population. But then, every suburban developer that has almost like a lottery for the single homes, the largest homes on the largest lots. That's where people are sleeping out because of large families. I mean, that's a changing face of Ottawa now. So, but this is, in my mind, this is not part and parcel of that. Okay, where am I going next? Councillor Nussbaum.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to staff. Just a question about the specific properties in Document 1. I understand the relevance of why these 8 or 10 or so properties are subject to specific site rezoning.
One of the things that we wanted to be really clear about here with as we move forward is we're interested in regulating unregulated rooming houses. That is, those ones that are purporting to be dwelling units but are in fact looking more like a rooming house. Properties that have been identified here are fully licensed, fully regulated rooming houses that are currently operating in legal conformance with the rooming house licensing bylaw. And so that's certainly not the intent of what this R4 is about. We're certainly not intending to remove the rights of an existing room operating in that location, but rather what we would like to see is we'd like to see that those who are operating in an unregulated fashion to move towards a licensed rooming house type situation. But again, we did not want to create a situation where those who are operating in conformance with city bylaws, that they would be penalized by this issue.
So these properties represent the totality of licensed rooming houses in the City of Ottawa?
Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, no, there are many more licensed rooming houses already in existence. The reason these specific and they are not the target of this study. The reason these specific properties are proposed to have zoning exceptions applied to them is because in the technical process of rewriting the existing zoning to remove all of the contradictions and the things that make it difficult to decisively identify a rooming house, we necessarily changed the wording. The intent was to maintain the continued intent. However, by virtue of some of the changes in the wording, that would technically have made some of these rooming houses non-conforming or non-complying. And the intent is to ensure that they are not adversely affected by that. That's the reason for those exceptions.
Thank you for that. My last question relates to the extension of the interim control bylaw, which I support. But just so that I understand, are there properties that are currently captured in the interim control bylaw that will no longer be captured in the interim control bylaw after these zoning amendments are made? So are there a gray area where some properties will continue to be captured, but the definitions, the 3 criteria in the interim control bylaw will mean that some will be removed from that category?
Mr. Madam Chair, no. The interim control bylaw will continue out of full effect. All of the clauses will remain in force. As it so happens, the 4-bedroom limitation in the interim control bylaw will also be covered under this. The 120 square meter unit cap size will continue to be in effect. The 500 square meter total floor area will also continue to be in effect as well.
Thank you. Councillor Blais?
Thank you very much. I guess a little bit like Alice in Wonderland, I want to jump down this suburban issue hole for a second and hopefully clarify in my mind some of the concerns. And please correct me at any time if I'm making improper assumptions from what I've heard. So if I buy a townhome in most of our suburban communities today from any of the big builders, it's a 3-bedroom unit, master bedroom, 2 smaller bedrooms. Most townhomes these days are coming with fully finished basements with the option to rough in a bathroom. Under this change, by right, I would be allowed to build at least 1 bedroom in the basement, pursuant to the other building code regulations. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Perfect. And that would bring me to a total of 4. But if I, for some reason, have a larger than typical family, and I don't think my kids should share a bedroom, or there are privacy issues or something like this, and I've extra kids, or maybe I've got a lot of kids and I want to move my parents in or something like this, and I wanted to put 2 bedrooms into the basement, this would prohibit that without me seeking some kind of exemption. I know.
Yes, on the face of it, it would. So if you had 4-bedroom townhouse and you wish to have a 5-bedroom townhouse and you wished for those bedrooms to be occupied at all times as bedrooms and you wished them to be used and designed as bedrooms, then you would need to seek relief.
And would that be committee of adjustment or through a full-blown zoning change?
I think in the case of going through from a 4-bedroom to a 5-bedroom, if you have a legitimate need where you are a family and you're wishing to add 1 bedroom for your child, you can certainly seek relief from the committee of adjustment.
And so I guess my question to you or to Mr. Mark or whomever is that an interpretation from you today, having worked on it forever, understanding the discussion here today, that is subject to change when you inevitably get promoted and someone else had a job, or is that defined very specifically in the bylaw as presented to us?
Mr. Mark?
Madam Chair, all decisions of the Committee of Adjustment are subject to their review and consideration of what meets the 4 tests. I would suggest that what a planner said at the committee that considered the bylaw, as reflected in the minutes of the committee's consideration, is going to be an important consideration, but it is not, never will be determinative, Madam Chair.
That's fair. Is it permissible under the law and under our practices to, within the bylaw that will be passed with this report, establish council's view that the exemption that I just described should in fact be dealt with and agreed upon by the Committee of Adjustment as opposed to requiring a full-blown zoning change?
As the report does, Madam Chair, language can be inserted that in a report or a council document that provides council's statement of intent. Okay. But Section 45 allows council to say what cannot go to the Committee of Adjustment. There is no statutory tool to say that what can go to the Committee of Adjustment.
That's fair. Is it possible for you, Mr. Mark, in the next few minutes to language, I suppose this could wait till council.
Yeah, or before council.
That would articulate council's intent that for matters that I've just discussed for, particularly large families, particularly when we're trying to keep the family unit together, that council's intention is not to be exceedingly dramatic and we would, do you know what I'm getting at?
Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, if I may, maybe I can make a proactive suggestion is that rather than trying to come up with language which the law really doesn't contemplate, that Ms. Snedden and I can work on an operational directive to which indicates how they should treat these matters in a pre-consultation setting, and that will put on record the intent. And if you wish to back that up through a direction, we can develop a motion between now and council for that.
Yeah, I'd be perfectly happy with that if that's the easiest way to go. That's fine with me. Thank you. I have no other questions.
Good points. And finally, we have Councillor Hubley. Do you want to come back on again?
I asked that Councillor Blake took care of that with Mr. Lewis. I don't think, based on our discussions, you have nothing more to add. We can deal with it. Correct, Mr. Lewis?
Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, I believe we have addressed the question.
So that addresses my concerns about the larger families as well. I just want something, a process that's affordable and simple that families can follow. If you've got 6 kids at home, the last thing you want to do is spend a day here at Planning Committee to be allowed to build a bedroom. So, okay, thank you.
That's a good point. Okay, so now we're going back over to Chair Moffat.
Thank you very much. So, no questions for Agricultural Affairs Committee? So that so on the report then, because we're not dealing with the amendments, the Agricultural Affairs Committee recommend that Council approve an amendment to zoning bylaw 2008-250 as shown in document 2, and 2, the Agricultural Affairs Committee approve the consultation detail section of this report. Is that item carried? Carried. Thank you. In-camera items, none. Notice of motions, none. Inquiries, none. Other business, none. Adjournment? Carried. Thank you.
No, now we come back to Planning Committee. The committee that just keeps on going. No stop. Thank you, Chairman and members. Some of your members get to stay here on the Planning Committee now. Okay, so we have thank you, Chair Moffat. So we have three motions on this item that have been brought forward. One by Councillor Chiarelli, which he introduced and explained. Two by Tierney. So we'll vote on the Chiarelli motion first. You already did. Okay. So on the Chiarelli motion, is that carried? Okay, so then on the Vice Chair Tierney first motion, which is the technical motion, is that carried? And on the Vice Chair Tierney motion on the Committee of Adjustments, is that carried? Carried. So on the item as amended? Carried. Thank you. I want to especially thank the both of you. I think that, you know, I've rarely seen anybody more prepared to answer questions. Sometimes, you know, questions go in directions that nobody ever expected them to, and I find that no matter what we threw at you today, you were good to go and you came up with an answer. And so thanks everyone that has been working on this. And good luck in the next step. When does that start, Mr. Wise?
June 14th.
June 14th?
As soon as this passes through council.
So the next phase, and that one will be the one that is most fun.
More fun.
More fun. Okay. All right, thank you very much. So next we're going to the second item, which is the Ottawa Hospital's Civic Trauma Center, which is an address of zoning bylaw amendment and official plan amendment, part of 930 Carling Avenue and 520 Preston Street. Sean Moore is going to do a presentation. And then we have a series of speakers. This is who I have. I have Cameron Love is with us, and Cameron, you'll be at the end for questions and wrap-ups, right? Then we have starting off when we get to questions after the presentation, and we're going to go right to the delegations after. Why don't you do that while we're getting set up? Councillor Brockington has a motion on this item, but the speakers I have are Noel Lomer, Dr. Frank Johnson, Dr. Dietland Gardel, Kathy Kennedy, David Jeans, or Hunter McGill. David Jeans is here, and Hunter McGill is here. I saw you both. Pardon? Hunter McGill. Okay, so I'm crossing your name out. So Hunter's going to be coming forward, George Lang, and then Cameron. So go ahead with your motion, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not going to debate at this point. Read it onto the public record, and the intent is to ensure that the delegations are aware of motions that are coming. So whereas, and committee members, this is in the shared drive, whereas the federal government is providing 58 lease to the Ottawa Hospital on experimental farmlands as the new location of the Ottawa Civic Hospital, whereas publicly accessible open space has been identified by community feedback as an essential component of the hospital design, in particular the 5 acres currently zoned L3 and the designated agriculture research area at the southern portion of the site. The proposed Preston Carling District Secondary Plan Amendment requires the inclusion of publicly accessible open space into the Ottawa Hospital project. And whereas the proposed zoning bylaw amendment requires approval by Planning Committee and Council of a master site plan with the inclusion of publicly accessible open space prior to lifting the holding provision. Therefore, be it resolved that Planning Committee directs staff to work with the Ottawa Hospital and the Community Engagement Group on the delivery of open space, and in particular open space adjacent to the Central Experimental Farm. And I'll speak to that.
Thank you. So welcome Don Herwire and Sean Moore. And
thanks, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Just setting the table for Mr. Moore here. So just a reminder, it's within a couple of weeks of the 1-year anniversary of Planning Committee's direction to bring the plan and zoning bylaw amendments. to align the city's planning documents with the federal decision to locate the hospital at the site before us. Since that time, we've been busy. There's been extensive community consultation and engagement, as you'll hear about. The 99-year lease between the federal government and the Ottawa Hospital was finalized in February. The hospital is currently active in the very initial phases of planning the new hospital campus and is undergoing processes with the provincial ministries. Staff believe the report before you today creates the planning policy framework and planning tools that will result in a state-of-the-art facility surrounded by green spaces and anchored in the community. Just a reminder, there's probably another 2 to 3 years of design process ahead of us that will allow stakeholders many more opportunities to contribute to the creation of this facility. And Sean will now walk us through a brief presentation, after which we'd be pleased to answer any of your questions.
Good morning, Madam Chair. The site is approximately 21 hectares and located both within the Central Experimental Farm and within mixed-use designation of the city's official plan. As Mr. Herwire presented, this presentation is going to outline how staff propose to align the city's official plan and the zoning bylaw amendment with the federal land use decision to lease this property to the Ottawa Hospital. The neighborhood is quite a dynamic neighborhood, so I'll walk you through some of these dynamics. The O-train line bisects the property east. Preston Street, traditional Main Street, is located adjacent to the property. Carlene and Arterial Main Street is located abutting the property. The Central Experimental Farm is to the southwest. Eden is to the south and east. Dow's Lake and the Rideau Canal are located adjacent to the property to the east. There are several federally recognized and designated buildings, including the Dominion Observatory adjacent to the property. There's a dynamic mixed-use center around Preston Street to the north and the stable low-rise community to the north as well. The city engaged the public in a public hearing a public meeting back in September. Approximately 90 residents attended, and the Ottawa Hospital held 7 public meetings throughout the Eastern Ontario, 5 of which were in Ottawa. And also in January 2018, the hospital hosted a public open house at the Horticulture Building on Lansdowne Park, which approximately 200 people attended that session that presented the draft concept. Staff have a dedicated website that we put up online for this item, and as well as the Ottawa Hospital, and the Ottawa Hospital has engaged the community, patients, and stakeholders in a campus engagement group. In total, we heard from approximately 115 residents who commented on the application. These are just some of the themes that informed our report. The site is designated mixed-use center. That's approximately comprises 6 hectares of the property. 15 hectares comprises general urban area, and including the 5-hectare parcel, which is agricultural resource area. There is also an arterial Main Street abutting the property to the north. Staff's proposal to redesignate the 5-hectare parcel, which is agri-resource area, to general urban area. There's a secondary plan which governs some of the policies for this site as well, which is the Preston District Secondary Plan. The secondary plan is designated station area, which is intended to implement transit supportive uses. There's a height schedule in the secondary plan, which ranges from 9 to 20 stories on the subject land. And staff's proposal is to amend that secondary plan to include the full site of the Ottawa Hospital into the secondary plan, and to redesignate the property from its existing station area and the new lands within the Central Experimental Farm to a new hospital area designation. Further, staff are looking to amend the height schedule to include up to 15 stories on the east side of the O-train line and 20 stories on the approximate 15 hectares of land which the Carlene building is located on adjacent to the farm. And I should just note that the staff are also proposing to amend a public realm plan, which would ensure that public open space is a component of the hospital site, and what we're calling a central experimental farm line, which requires massing, transition, and open space and sensitivity through urban design analysis when the hospital goes through its urban design and site plan master site plan exercise. There are numerous zones currently on the property. The site is zoned with an exception on the east side of the O-Train line, mixed-use center, arterial Main Street, subzone 10, arterial Main Street, and the central experimental farm zone. Approximately 13 hectares of the property currently permits hospital use within the MC and the O1 zones. The proposed zoning bylaw amendment is to unify the site into one unified zone, which is a major exception zone. Institutional zones are the zones which all the other Ottawa hospital sites are zoned within the city. The exception zone would be to permit additional ancillary uses of research and development and food retail. And the exception zone would be to remove uses that really the hospital is not developing and are in the current parent zone, such as correctional facility, rooming house, sports arena, and others. And the key to the zoning is a holding provision. Staff are recommending that an H be placed on the property until such time as a master plan is approved by Planning Committee and Council, and that master plan would include connectivity to the transit station. It would include urban design analysis, architectural analysis. We'd also be looking at an H to ensure that transportation impact assessment is completed, a cultural heritage impact statement is completed, and master servicing is done. We also expect that there'll be several sessions with the city's urban design review panel and our partners at the National Capital Commission's their advisory committee on planning, design, and realty. So there is more design to come through those processes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that presentation. At this point, we'll hold our questions for staff. We'll go directly to public delegations. Our first delegate is Noel Lomer. Noel, are you here? I'll just go to... Good morning, Noel. I'll get you to, Noel, to turn your microphone on. Just pull it close to you, please. And you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Chair and councillors and members of the public, good morning. My name is Noel Lomer. I'm a resident of the Civic Hospital area. I'd like to thank Mr. Moore and the Planning Department for accepting the recommendations of the community to ensure institutional zoning on the proposed Dow's Lake Central Experimental Farm site so that residential condominiums will not be developed on the site. The community is opposed to private lands being transferred to private development, public lands being transferred to private development. The Ottawa Hospital engagement and response of April 2018 did not address one key issue: access by emergency vehicles to the proposed hospital site. There's a proposal to embed study of transportation in the zoning and secondary plan, but no requirement to ensure access by emergency vehicles. I would move to amend the official plan and zoning bylaw to require that access by emergency vehicles to the Ottawa Hospital be ensured so that patients' lives will not be endangered by delays in accessing the proposed hospital. Why is access important? The Ottawa Hospital Board in November 2016 gave 3 reasons for rejecting the NCC recommendation of the Tunney's Pasture site. They were, quote, access, cost of land remediation, and timelines, unquote. The primary issue was access. The fear of the board was understandable. Doctors have a duty of care to patients to ensure patients in urgent need who may be unable to get through traffic in time, resulting in death in an ambulance. The Ottawa Hospital gave access as their reason, despite the statement by the Ottawa Paramedic Service, published 12 days before in the Ottawa Citizen, quote, using our historical call data, there is no evidence that the new location, Tunney's, will have a negative impact on response times as the new location remains within the urban core and is close to the 417, unquote. There's no evidence that the board considered the traffic and congestion inherent in their chosen site on the lake and farm opposite the Preston-Carling Secondary Plan Complex. The Board of Governors, quote, had an in-depth discussion of the report and their significant concerns, recommendations, unquote, and the board took 1 hour and 15 minutes to discuss and reject the NCC study, which was conducted over 7 months with full impact from Ottawa citizens. If they were aware of potential access problems for the Ottawa Hospital opposite one of the largest building complexes in Ottawa's history, this was not recorded in the minutes. Nor is there any evidence that Mayor Watson, the 7 local MPPs, and the federal minister, Catherine McKenna, considered access issues in the subsequent 3 days of private discussions that overturned the Tunney's site in favor of the Dow's Lake Farm site. Has the Planning Committee and Planning Department considered the access of emergency vehicles? Have you asked the Ottawa Paramedic Service for their view of the impact on response times? Some of the 21 buildings being built as planned in the Preston-Carling Secondary Plan are 45 and 55 stories. That's twice as high as the Peace Tower. With all the cars, buses, delivery vehicles, taxis, bike and pedestrian traffic, not to mention the staff, from this high-density area, how can emergency access be provided? Preston is 2-lane. Prince of Wales is 2-lane. The historic and beautiful 2-lane Queen Elizabeth Drive will be affected by increased traffic. Will it be used for emergency vehicle access? Carling has 6 lanes, but the arterial Main Street designation of Carling Avenue allows 12-story development on the north and south sides of Carling Avenue, and this will also increase Carling traffic. The intersection of Carling and Preston now is already slow or blocked during busy periods. The transitway will help pedestrian traffic, but not ambulance traffic. How will emergency vehicles access the site from the 417? If the committee is thinking of Sherwood Drive and Sherwood Drive and Bayswater for emergency and overflow traffic, you can expect full and total opposition. To answer this bottleneck issue, you must take a long-term view of the access after completion of the complex of 21 buildings in perhaps 5 or 10 years, not existing occupancy today. Emergency vehicles access to the hospital will be impeded and patients' lives may be endangered. This could end in tragedy.
Thank you.
And if there's tragedy, there will certainly be lawsuits. The committee should amend the proposal.
Thank you, sir. Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Lomer? Thank you for coming out, sir.
Thank you.
Next up is Dr. Frank Johnson, coming with Legoland.
Seismically active area.
Wait, hang on a second, sir. So you sit down and we won't start the clock ticking until you're ready.
Very good.
And that's,
there is a video of this, and thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for your... Can you lift the mic up a little bit, please? Pull it as far towards you as you can.
Okay. Thank you.
And you have 5 minutes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have produced a video of this so you can review it at your leisure. It is a model of the secondary plan which your colleagues have just referred to. I've taken it from this, but with some of the building heights, which are to scale, two floors per Lego block. And that is what the secondary plan envisages for the north side of Carling, runs along here. And you are looking down Preston Street, if you can see down there. There are approximately 10 to 15,000 residents and workers going to be brought into this area. I have no idea what the actual figure is. You can imagine the movement that takes place every day. There is also in that plan a nationally significant building, somewhere
down here. The amendment, I think, is going to take that away. The new proposal is to put the major hospital on the southwest corner, probably extending much further than that. This will bring another 5,000 or so residents and workers into that area. The current Carling hospital is about 800 or 900 patients. I think there's about 3,000 people work there every day. The hospital is deliberately low-rise, it's therefore low intensification, nothing like the intensification envisaged here. A lot of surface parking is being asked for, which again is against the philosophy of what this area seems to have in the official plan. All of that will, as my colleague Noel just mentioned, exacerbate the access for emergency vehicles and possibly for everybody else. My suggestion is the proposal conflicts, and it's not in the public interest to do a completely disparate proposal like that, and therefore it doesn't make good planning and it doesn't make really good sense. There is, however, to this. There is a study by an emergency doctor in Toronto who shows that if you live or work on the 4th floor or above in a high-rise building, your chances of survival go down by about 50% from the 4th floor down to almost nothing further up. By having the hospital emergency care so close, you obviously improve those chances of survival, provided you can get across the road. And that is my point, that you've made this rather muddled bit of development. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your submission in advance, and thank you very much for the model. Our Director of Planning beside me, do you want to make a comment on that?
I was just indicating to Madam Chair, I think I'm going to start buying staff the Lego pieces as well. I think that's fantastic. Thank you.
Well, it does put it in perspective for sure. Next speaker is Dr. Dietland Gardell.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, members. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge respectfully that we are discussing the unceded land of the Algonquins, who hold an annual power on this very spot we are discussing. I have 3 comments and questions. The currently chosen site borders the National Heritage Site of the Central Experimental Farm, and Rideau Canal World Heritage Site with Dow's Lake. On June 27, 2007, the Rideau Canal received the status of World Heritage Site in significance comparable to the Taj Mahal and Machu Picchu. It fulfilled all 10 detailed selection criteria. However, already the first 5-year review revealed deficiencies by the stakeholders which were not reported. Thanks to the Ottawa Citizen, in 2013, a pressed, quotation mark, UNESCO report about weaknesses in the stewardship for the site was described. Question: has the proposed plan to build the large Ottawa Hospital been communicated to the UNESCO Heritage Site Committee for a re-evaluation of all criteria and for the continued designation of World Heritage status? Preston-Carling District secondary plans and the current hospital plans been communicated to the UNESCO Heritage Committee? If the City of Ottawa Planning Committee assumes the authority, as I heard, for all heritage issue, by whom, to whom, and when were these plans to squeeze a new large hospital between the CEP Natural Heritage Site and the Rideau World Heritage Site communicated? Was it the value of the city? What is the value of the heritage impact statement? Who is accountable for this new review process? Will all results of time be communicated in a timely manner? Comment 2, regarding the size. Are any undisclosed consideration for the acquisition of further acreage from the current 988 acres farm of the CEP? Is the creation of 5,000 to 7,000 expected jobs to create an employment anchor of the district the central economic consideration for the final master plan design? Have the transport safety aspects for a highly condensed development area been considered? As the speaker before me mentioned, how could the safety of high-rise residents be guaranteed in case of fire or health emergency? With regards to the recent fire in a fortunately non-occupied student residence, high-rise residence in the area, where already today, during rush hour, the Carlton-Preston area is completely clogged and building access is blocked. And comment 3, to document 5, consultation, question. To point 3, why was Tony's pasture site not closed? That was the question. Why was the Tony's pasture site not chosen for the new hospital? The answer was the federal government has made the decision to lease the Sir John Carling site to the Ottawa Hospital through a 99-year lease, which came into effect in February 23rd, 2018. That represents a non-answer, a disrespectful non-answer, because the federal government already owns the Tony's pasture site. Second, why have the true reasons for the current decision not been communicated? Which role, if any, did city developers play in the decision? Has a non-biased comparative site analysis been carried out? And if so, when will the results be shared with the public? Is the public consultation process considered to be complete enough to be reduced to public input to 20 persons from a community group to community members, stakeholders, and patients? And how can the originally announced 10-year process suddenly be completed in under 8 years for the hospital to open in 2025? In conclusion, this process at this early stage lacks some transparency and has disturbing precedents of suppressed and misleading information. The public communication process is insufficient.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
I think I will ask either Don or Sean just to succinctly tell us what's before us today, because many of the things that you brought up have nothing to do with what we're talking about today, and they're not before us. And so what is before us is...
Madam Chair, before us is the official plan amendment to redesignate a portion of the lands from agricultural area to general urban area, and to amend the secondary plan, language in the secondary plan, to bring a new boundary, a new Ottawa Hospital area into the secondary plan, and to rezone the entire property from its multiple zones to one major institutional zone to permit the Ottawa Hospital.
And only the Ottawa Hospital.
That's correct.
Yeah. But thank you very much, Doctor, for coming. Next up, we have Kathy Kennedy, Chair of Planning Civic Hospital Neighborhood Association. Kathy? Is George Lang here? George, you might as well come and take this seat over here, since everybody seems to be going to either side. Go ahead, Ms. Kennedy, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Kathy Kennedy. I'm Chair of Planning for the Civic Hospital Neighborhood Association, and my community has many questions about the civic campus development, but today I'm going to focus on some of the issues that were discussed at a neighborhood meeting last Tuesday. Our association is really pleased that the city has moved from its original proposal to zone part of the part of the site is mixed use to major institutional. This is, we feel, an appropriate zoning for the site. We're looking for confirmation that any permitted uses for this site will be ancillary to a hospital. And we also note that a retail food store has been listed as an ancillary use, and that this store could be as large as 10% of the gross floor area of the hospital, we assume. So we're just wondering if this use and this size is found in other hospitals in our region. With respect to the holding provisions, we have, we're interested in actually all of the studies, but because of the time I have, I'd like to focus on the transportation strategies. This large campus and its location will have a major impact on all forms of mobility in our community. And this site is a connector for pedestrians who use the walking paths in Queen Juliana Park to access the Arboretum and the farm, cyclists the multi-use pathway and who use Queen Juliana Park for their daily commutes, transit users who frequent the old train, Carling Avenue, and of course vehicular traffic. We believe a complete mobility study should be part of the transportation impact assessment. And to drive home this point, I'd like to point out that the city's transportation services has been directed to undertake an area traffic management study road in advance of the construction of the Hard Rock Casino, with the objective of improving local traffic conditions. And we expect that a major downtown medical facility such as the new Civic Campus will require similar and perhaps even more rigorous ATM studies as part of the transportation impact assessment, and that these should be done early in the process before the holding provision is removed. The current draft design of the new Civic Campus is of major concern to our community, in particular the vehicle access to the site that seems to be extending from Sherwood Avenue in the current design. Our community worked diligently the city to remove a road link through Queen Juliana Park, which was proposed in the Preston Carling mobility study, and which would have had a really negative impact as it would have diverted traffic onto our local residential streets, in particular Sherwood Drive and Bayswater Avenue. So when the road link reappeared in a planning document related to the zoning for 845 Carling Avenue in February 2015, Councillor Lee with you planning committee and our community to resolve this situation and directed staff to remove this link because of community opposition. Our community assumes that the city will be true to its word and oppose any road links through or into Queen Juliana Park. And though we're not architects, I'd like to echo many of the comments of the Urban Design Review panel, particularly the current insular structure that seems to be turning its back on our neighborhood, the current look of the hospital, while seeming to direct traffic onto our residential streets. We agree with the panel that the Civic Campus should be oriented as much as possible along Carling Avenue, with perhaps a low-rise interface. Not only will this present a friendlier edge to the neighborhood, as the panel notes, but it more consistent policy on humanizing our arterial main streets and might help protect more green space in the interior. This would also serve to define Carling Avenue as the hospital's natural access road, which it most certainly should be. So our community association is looking forward to being actively involved as this process moves forward, and we've set up a permanent civic relocation committee being headed by our Vice President, Peter Eady, and I encourage the city and the hospital to use our committee as a sounding board for community input as this project moves forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kennedy, and I wanted to ask our General Manager, Mr. Willis, to comment on several of you brought up transportation and that, so I just think that Mr. Willis?
So, Madam Chair, one of the holding provisions in the proposed bylaw certainly is a transportation study, and that is absolutely something of concern to us. Many of the issues related to the way the various circulations around the site, access to Sherwood, which the hospital has actually written and committed they would not pursue, dealt with in the actual transportation study. It is premature to do that right now because until the hospital actually has a program approved by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, they can't model the transportation impacts. So this is a step that will come. It's just not an appropriate step for today, but down the road they will do it, and the hospital has committed as part of their community engagement process to involve the community in discussions on that.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Over to you, Mr. Lang.
I'm going to set myself a timer here so I can see it. My name's George Lang. I come here representing Reimagine Ottawa. My view on this application is that it needs to be rejected. My concerns revolve around one word, and that word is trust. There are too many details in this land deal / application. We need to have faith in the people behind the application. We should be able to trust that our elected representatives are constantly looking out for the greater good. But throughout this process, the evidence shows. In 2014, the long-term plan for Tunney's pasture was issued. In it, there are about $2 to $3 billion worth of development. This is a plan to take public land at Tunney's and turn it over to developers. And this plan is still in effect. This is a huge piece of development. Naturally, the friends of the development community would want to protect that plan. Pierre Poilievre even said that choosing Tunney's pasture will require that a currently planned residential development be canceled. The NCC knew about this project at Tunney's and considered that when they were doing their deliberations. They did their deliberations across 21 criteria, and on balance, they still decided that Tunney's was the best site for the hospital. They did an excellent public consultation as well. They had input from over 7,000 citizen taxpayers. Yet after the NCC's announcement, in the space of less than a week, behind closed doors, the mayor managed to strong-arm 3 levels of government to overturn the NCC's decision and protect the developer's dream of the Tunney's long-term plan. How can we trust our municipal government when a fair and balanced decision is overturned with no reasons given? City councillors and the mayor sign up to a code of conduct. That code includes that members of council recognize that the public has a right to open government and transparent making. Was this transparent decision making overturning the NCC's recommendation? Why should taxpayers ever again bother to provide input to a public consultation? How can we trust that the details in this application are for the greatest good? There were earlier versions of this application that allowed condos and offices on this public land that was specifically given for use as a hospital. And thankfully, the city relented on that, but only after intervention by the hospital itself. But does this help with trust? Can we trust the details in the application itself? I've heard it repeated that people are concerned that development at City Hall. Are they given special treatment?
You're this close to me cutting you off, okay? Because I don't allow developers to be disrespectful to anyone here in the audience, and I don't have, and in fact, I was going to cut you when you're talking about the mayor strong-arming people. So I'm just saying, please be polite and stick to the points.
I think I'm trying to. I've heard it repeated that people are concerned that developers run City Hall. Now, are they given special treatment? Okay. In 2015, a motion was raised that would have made it illegal for developers to donate twice to municipal election campaigns.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. If you can't stick to the subject, we're not having a conversation anymore. Hold the clock in case he decides he wants to. So if you please stick to what we have before us, which has been explained twice now.
I'm tying it to why it's very difficult for people to trust that's coming out of this situation. I'm concerned that the planning process is broken. Can I continue?
As long as you stay on the track of what is before us today.
Okay, I want to talk about an example of how the developers get special attention.
No. That's not before us.
Okay.
This isn't an opportunity for people to come out and malign whoever they feel like it. That's just not the way it works, and I'm very fair to everybody. I have been, as I said in the chair, be fair to everyone. But this is about the Ottawa Hospital, Civic Trauma Center, and what has been described by both of our staff beside you as what's before us. So what is your thought? Do you, and by the way, there isn't a developer, so you can stop talking about the developers. This is the hospital at this point that we're talking about.
The issues are that the developers fund the campaigns of the members of this.
All right, there you go, you're done. Thank you.
I'd be happy.
No, you know what, sir? Get back in your seat or leave. All right, who do we have next? Oh, we have Cameron Love from the Ottawa Hospital. Oh, sorry. Here, come on up. No, come up. Hunter, sorry for the distraction. I know that your presentation will be eloquent. Okay. Anyone in this room knows the way things roll here, okay? Welcome, Mr. McGill. You're here on behalf of Heritage Ottawa?
And Friends of the Rideau, a not-for-profit organization which supports the protection and preservation of the Rideau Canal.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Chair and committee members, this morning for the opportunity to speak with you. Choosing our words very carefully, Heritage Ottawa and Friends of the Rideau do not oppose the proposed rezoning to the institutional, for an institutional use of the site. In fact, through our very helpful discussion with Mr. Sean Moore, and we would like to compliment him for the amount of time and energy and attention he's given to responding to ours and many other inquiries and requests for clarification. Thank you. But there is, through this proposal, greater clarity in terms of the use of the property, and that is to be welcomed. We do signal our intention to continue to monitor the way in which that institutional designation will be applied and interpreted. There have been some difficulties in terms of properly appreciating the dimensions of the proposed rezoning, and due to problem with mapping and other basic data, and we're assured by the planner that in fact that this will be corrected, and that of course given the site is not an insignificant issue, but we understand that that is in fact being corrected. The issue of height. I'm sorry, I don't have I've lost my Lego set, so I can't do as one of the previous speakers did and give you some visual depictions, but we are concerned about the height that is embedded in this, the new proposed height allowances which are embedded in this rezoning proposal before you. We feel that the proposed height restriction on the western portion of the Sir John Carling section of the site is in fact excessive. We feel that the equivalent of 15 stories should be in place for the full both the east end portion and the west portion, bisected by the O train. And in fact, were we to have our druthers, we think that the new structure, and we realize that this of course is a subsequent phase of the work of the city working with the hospital, should not be any higher than the previous demolished Sir John Carling building. Finally, and probably closest to our particular remit, the text of the document before you quite properly cites the requirement for a cultural heritage impact statement. And This, of course, will have to look at issues around protection and remediation of not just one National Historic Site, the Central Experimental Farm, but two. The Rideau Canal is also a National Historic Site as well as being a World Heritage Site. We have a responsibility in that respect to ensure that these two important elements of our national culture, our patrimoine, are in fact protected. I might also add that from the perspective of the Friends of the Rideau, it's worth noting that as part of its assessment of the proposal, the candidacy of the Rideau Canal for World Heritage Site status, that in fact the assessors, an independent group, not Canadians, but an independent group, drew attention to the importance of protecting heritage landscapes and the heritage views along the Rideau Canal. And this, in the heart of the capital city, is a particularly critical issue. So we're concerned that an overly large and an overly tall building will in fact prejudice the cultural landscape which has been in place for a very, very long time. We ask that in fact as the procedure, and I may be testing the limits of the subject to be discussed this morning, but we ask very much that as the heritage site characteristics of the building are looked at, that it be respectful and sympathetic to the site.
Thank you, sir. And two people have questions for you. Yes, first of all, Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, sir, for your presentation. I just need you to elaborate for me. I don't understand how proposed height of 12 stories is excessive along Carling. In Councillor Leeper's ward and mine further west, we've got towers coming in that are in the 35 plus range. 12 is not excessive. I don't understand how this takes away from the canal. When you look at all the building at Carlton, Ottawa U, apartment at 5th Avenue, we're building a bridge over the canal. Nothing, in my mind, detracts from the overall heritage of the canal. If you've ever been to Amsterdam, you've got buildings all up and down the canal. So I'm trying to understand the link that you're making between potential tall buildings. If the hospital were to build smaller buildings, they will need to build on more green space. That's the trade-off. Build taller, use less green space, build shorter, need more green space. So can you address those two main points? One is how it takes away from the heritage of the canal and the height issue.
You've asked a rather complex question, Councillor. I think from the standpoint of protecting heritage landscapes, we have, for all its faults and all its merits, the Sir John Carling building, the structure which no longer exists, was a pretty modest structure on that particular section of landscape. It certainly did not loom over the canal. By the way, the reference to Amsterdam, I'm sorry, I think you may want to rethink that particular reference. Those canals are in a totally, and those structures are in a totally different cultural context. With respect to tall buildings, I will only speak personally at this juncture, that I think that it has been a very unfortunate element of the planning process that the cluster of structures which exist now at the intersection of Preston and Carling and others which are proposed there are not particularly consistent with the heritage landscape, nor, I think, are they particularly consistent with good planning and livability of cities. But clearly, we shouldn't go there this morning. With regard to the development at Lansdowne Park, I believe both Friends of the Rideau and Heritage Hall were on record at the time that development package was being put forward, that in fact we did not support it, and we felt that it was an unfortunate development. I have personal views about the bridge at Fifth Avenue, but I better keep them to myself.
Thank you. Councillor Weeper now, are you finished, Councillor Barkington? Did you have another thing? Okay. Councillor Weeper?
So I think I will pick up on Councillor Brockington's point in just a moment. Sorry, you mentioned errors in mapping. I'm just wondering if I can get a couple quick more details on that one.
I wouldn't want to take the committee's time this afternoon, to get into the details, but it seemed that some of the boundaries that were initially, that constituted the material that we were initially basing some of our analysis on were not as precise as they might have been. But we understand from Mr. Sean Moore that in fact this is being corrected so that subsequent phases of this whole dialogue will in fact be on the basis of shared and correct information. Thank you.
Thank you. To pick up on Councillor Brockington's point, the heritage views, the cultural landscape, something that is sympathetic and respectful of it. I think I probably have more sympathy for that view than my colleague, but what would be the impact of this hospital on the Rideau Canal, the UNESCO site, if it were built as currently designed?
The candidacy of the canal for World Heritage Site status was assessed on the basis of a number of factors. It represents a real genius of built construction. Of now, this year is the 186th year of operations of the Rideau Canal. At the start of the 19th century, this was in fact very modern technology, and we have, in part through luck, but also through deliberate design, we have preserved that technology. We have preserved the landscape that it helped create. Let's not forget that when John By was designing the canal, Dow's Lake was not a lake, it was a swamp. And there was a nice little stream that ran down Preston Street. I'm no geotechnician, but I would imagine that the people who have been designing and constructing those amazing buildings along Preston at Carling had some very interesting challenges before them as they took those kinds of factors into account. But when the World Heritage Site assessment was being done by representatives of the International the International Council on Monuments and Sites, the landscape was an important element of that assessment. How much did it represent the landscape of the time at which the canal was designed and constructed? In the proposal to create as high as 20-story structures on the site in question that's being reviewed, that will quite dramatically change that particular set of heritage landscapes, historic landscapes. There's nothing that we can do, speaking on behalf of the two organizations, about the very tall structures that have been constructed, are being constructed now. But we do feel that it is very important to register how significant that landscape of the Central Experimental Farm, the views in many directions from Dow's Lake of the Rideau Canal are, and how important it is, and how we have a responsibility to do our best to protect them. And so our suggestion is that in fact, that rather than the 20-story upper limit that is being proposed in the zoning bylaw, that in fact we restrict it to the equivalent of 15 stories and through the design process do our best. And I say that in a community sense, do our best to preserve the heritage landscapes. Thank you.
And I'm sorry, Chair, I do know we have a number of people coming out.
We have
one quick
a lot
follow-up.
of people, and we're going to plow through lunch too.
The second question is, I take very seriously the point of the Civic Hospital Neighborhood Association with a design that is required to enhance the urban edge, enhance the Carling edge. Clearly, from what you're telling us, it's also going to be critical that we take a look at that south face of it as well.
Yeah. Yes, that is correct.
It's going to have to be a 360 well-designed
very
complex.
Much so. Yes, right. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Miguel, for coming out.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Council.
Okay, now we're going over to Cameron. Did you want to say a few words, and then we'll go for questions? This is Cameron Love. Tell everybody who you are, and that if they have questions, they're welcome to ask.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Cameron Love. I'm the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at the Ottawa Hospital. So first off, Madam Chair and members, I want to thank you for having us here today and considering this application. We've worked very closely with city staff for a large number of months and support 100% the direction around the institutional zoning, but more importantly, also the holding provisions that are built within that. So I thought I'd just take 2 minutes just to make a couple of quick comments re-process. I think, I've had this good fortune of being in this business for 20 years, and developing hospitals is fairly unique. And when you look across Canada, it is probably the #1 issue that most jurisdictions, whether they're municipalities, provinces, or even the feds, are dealing with in terms of ensuring proper access to health care, and Ottawa is no different. The silver lining for us is we have a golden opportunity in terms of building something that will secure a proper infrastructure for healthcare access across this region. The last 2 or 3 years have seen a number of steps in this process, but we've made a lot of headway into it. In terms of process, the one thing I do think people need to understand is designing and building hospitals is a long process. This is not a 1-year ordeal. Most places across Ontario, it literally takes a quarter century, and by the time we get this built and open, we will be a quarter century from the first time we started planning this back in 2003-04. So from the point of view of process, though, while today is a great step forward, I think a lot of the comments that have been brought forward, we have to pay particular careful attention to in terms of all the process we're going to work through. And we've spent a lot of time, as the staff mentioned, doing a lot of engagement with the community. We've got a community engagement group that's been built that represents 17 community associations and others. And the next 2-3 years, we'll really be taking a careful look at all the aspects from a planning perspective, whether it's traffic or green space and all those pieces. And while we put out a concept design, there's a lot of work to come in terms of engaging all those groups to make sure we get it right. So thank you very much for having us there today, and happy to take questions.
Thank you, and I do want to say thank you for all the work you've done with the area councillors too. Certainly, if you took the time to read and consequently their communities, if you took the time to read the report today, I don't think I've ever seen such extensive comments from 4 councillors on one topic in a long time. So it's, or ever, actually not ever. So I'm really pleased that you have. And so I'm going to go first to Councillor Leeper, then Councillor Brockington. Anyone else have questions for Mr. Love? Almost called you doctor. That's like a James Bond movie. I just thought of that. Oh, grade 12, there you go. I mean, my grade 12, a long time ago. Councillor Leeper.
I forget.
I know.
Now I forget.
Now you're speechless. Good. Councillor Buckington? There's a method to my madness.
Mr. Love, thank you very much for being here. I think, no surprise, the key consideration for residents in Civic Hospital area is the transportation. And I'm going to be chatting during staff questions a lot about what those methodologies are going to be, thresholds, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to hear from you as you're talking to your provincial funders. Where do you feel the line is with respect to responsibility for sustainable transportation in the neighborhood beyond just the hospital's boundaries? You've heard a lot about some very precise concerns. Let's make sure that Sherwood doesn't come through into the hospital. How can we deal with some of the traffic on and off Carling? You've heard about emergency access, but the transportation impacts of the hospital will extend even further beyond. We have off-ramps, and people are thinking about the hospital with respect to the implications of how people will get on and off the Queensway because you are a regional facility. Where does your responsibility as a hospital for the implications or the impacts that the hospital have, where does that start and end?
That's a good question. Let me try and answer it in a couple of ways. First and foremost, a lot of the work, all the work we're doing with the province right now is really outlining what type of activity we are going to be having at the new Civic Campus in the future. And it's probably the most important piece because it drives how many people are coming to the campus and by what mode of transportation. So, you know, the difference between hospitals versus probably everything else that this planning committee deals with is there's not a form of transportation we don't see. Helicopters, ambulances, police cars, fire trucks, walking cars, bicycles, you name it, anything with wheels is coming to the organization.
Submarine?
Sorry?
Submarine?
Not yet. We'll see what we can do with the canal, though. But I think part of this is as we look at this, Jeff, we really have to spend a lot of time looking at this because it is probably the fundamental issue that many communities across Canada have grappled with, and some have got it right and some have not got it right, but they're all unique. So when I think about our responsibility within this, our responsibility is obviously to plan and work with all the people that I've mentioned in terms of build as a site. We also have a responsibility as we do these traffic studies with city staff, and we work with the NCC and Heritage Ottawa and everyone else on what are the overall implications in terms of access to the site. What are we doing? What's the uptake going to be with light rail? It's going to minimize the amount of parking that's going to need to be on site. We have to work through all of that, and we see our role not only as running the hospital, but being a member of that planning process, so that we have an overall transportation plan. When I say transportation, I don't mean just cars. I mean all those modes of transportation, and what the plan is from a regional perspective. Because if we don't get that right, at the end of the day, we're going to have trouble having people access the hospital, which is our role. But we have a role to support what the overall plan would be. And if that means putting that forward as part of the overall plan of the province, then we should be doing that as part of it. We don't have jurisdiction over what happens with the 417 or what you do with city streets. That's not our role. But we can play a supportive role in terms of what the overall plan in totality in terms of modes of transportation and the roadwork plan.
The key question around responsibility probably comes down to funding. Mm-hmm. I have no doubt that the city is going to do a good job of taking a look at all the various different transportation impacts, not just of the hospital, to be sure, a rapidly intensifying area, but somebody is going to need to pay for integration with the O train station. And that could be, if it's done properly, a pretty heavy piece of civil work. Someone needs to take a look at or someone is going to need to pay for the mitigations to ensure that Sherwood remains a livable street, Bayswater, Fairmont, those north-south streets that lead into the neighborhood. Where do you see that responsibility lying?
So when it comes to being on our site, that responsibility in terms of that overall plan and the total cost of development, no matter how many phases it is, that will be a part of our submission to the province in terms of the funding and the financing plan and all that pieces, which comes, 2-3 years down the road. Anything off the site will not be our jurisdiction. So if there's some major road work that's planned wherever it's going to be, it's got to be part of the overall plan. There may need to be submissions that go in parallel with that to the province. But from a Ministry of Health perspective, those pieces would not be considered within it. I think the other thing we have to be cognizant of, this is not going to be a one-phase deal. I think we really need to be looking at this from the perspective, this is probably literally a 10, 20, 30-year plan that shows what the end point is and phases of how we get there. When we do our planning, by ministry rules, we're planning out to 2040, 2050. Some of them are based on high-level assumptions, but when you start talking about the number of beds and the number of real estate, you want to plan your endpoints so you have it properly set up, but you phase it, and as you phase it, it changes what your impact is on things like access and transportation. So we have to plan the endpoint together, we have to think about how it's phased, and then we have to think about how that overall financing and funding arrangement will come as we do submissions to the province.
So I think what this plays into the fears that the community has, which is that the hospital, which is, obviously we're supportive of building a new hospital, and I think the discussion over where that hospital goes is done and over. Mm-hmm. It is most likely that we'll see the hospital here, barring some sort of unforeseen outcome down the road. But the community is concerned that we are going to approve the hospital without making the commitment in cooperation with the hospital, in cooperation with the city, in cooperation with the province, to fund the necessary transportation mitigations that we'll need. So I've heard you say, your jurisdiction stops
at the edge of the site. But what role will you play in helping us to understand what the mitigations are and working with us as a partner in mitigating some of those traffic impacts that no matter what goes into the hospital, we can certainly anticipate that it will have a major role to play in changing transportation patterns in the near west of Ottawa?
I understand exactly what you're saying, Councillor Leeper. I think our first step is to agree on what the overall plan is to start. Like, I look at the next year of work at a minimum, the amount of planning we have to do around transportation, access, program planning, those pieces, that all has to be done. That's going to form the basis of what the overall plan will be, not only for the site, but all the transportation, the access points, what are we doing with light rail, all those things. All that has to be built into the plan. And then we'll get into discussion of what we submit to the ministry and what pieces will form the basis of that hospital development plan. And there is going to have to be on-site roadwork for sure, but I've looked at what we've done in the past to the general campus and other pieces. We have put in other components outside of the ring of the hospital as part of that plan.
Right.
And I think we do collectively as a community need to push that forward. The question is what's the plan? So we've got to get the plan done, and then we'll talk about what the submission process is going to be like. But the plan is absolutely essential. One of the fundamental problems we have, and I think hopefully none of you ever had to visit the Civic, but if you have, we do not want to recreate the Civic 20 years from now. That's a complete failure on our part collectively. And I think that the access and the transportation piece will probably serve a huge portion of the work that we'll do with city staff and others over the course of the next year to 18 months.
Okay. I'll pursue this further with city staff. There is the permitted use that's been proposed for the hospital for a retail food store. The community is concerned that that could be allowed up to a fairly large size. Yeah. What are the commitments that you're willing to make today around what that food store would be, if there is one, and what kind of parameters you put around that?
So we're not putting in a Loblaws. So if you go across every hospital, actually on this planet, stick in Canada, when we say retail, what we're talking about are things for patients and families like coffee shops, pharmacies, typically a little convenience store if they want to get magazines. Basically, if you walk down the Civic, the General, the Mulford, the Queensway, you go to UHN, you're going to see little food outlets for patients, families to get. They're usually tied to the cafeteria, and then you have things like pharmacy, medical supply vendors, things that patients and families will require. Everything that we'll build from a retail perspective is garnered on what a patient and family needs when they're in the hospital building. It will not be around setting up, do we get into the food market from the perspective of we're going to set up a grocery store where everybody from the Preston area can come shopping at the hospital. That is not the retail plan. The retail plan is geared on what I just said.
And finally, Cameron, you've made a commitment to me and you've made a commitment to the community not to seek an entrance from Sherwood. Yes. And I think most people in the room understand that Sherwood looks an awful lot like a direct entry from the Queensway off of Parkdale Avenue. You've made that commitment. The other commitment that I'm seeking today is that you're not going to seek a link from Prince of Wales Drive to Carling Avenue or to Preston that would facilitate the traffic from Ottawa's south end onto Preston Street or onto Bayswater or Sherwood. Any road links between from north to south through the hospital would not be intended for carrying traffic from one part of the city to the other.
No, so part of this, Councillor, is really to do this next phase of planning. We do need to have access point. You can't have one access point to this hospital. Of course. You are definitely going to split the modes of transportation between ambulance and police versus general public versus down in the bottom quadrant where the light rail is going to come through. But when you look at just egress and entrance points going onto the site, we are going to need something from Carling and probably from Prince of Wales. How they maneuver through the site, what the orientation is that site. We have a concept plan, and we've given you that letter that there is no intention here at all that this is a bisector from Sherwood right through the site over Prince of Wales. That was never the intent, even though it looked like that. That road system is probably going to have to be altered, but we are going to need something that is going to connect between Carling and Prince of Wales in some manner to have traffic flow through there. But as I say, I'd be somewhat naive to try and give you some semblance of what the specific road plan would look like.
Yeah, because
until we get through that. We got to get through that. We got to get through
next
there right
phase.
now.
But I think the commitment I'm seeking, and I think I'm
Councilor
hearing...
Leeper, I don't, like, we know we're going to have a transportation, the master transportation envelope. Mr. Willis said this already, and that time will be the appropriate time to get into that. I don't think he's prepared to talk about that. This is what we have before us is what we have before us today.
Yep, and what we have before us is a number of the transportation.
And there's a holding symbol, as you know.
Yep, I've got the Chief Operating Officer here today, so I'm just looking for those commitments.
Well, I don't think he can make them, and it's fair if you
I think I've heard you make it, though, that this was not going to be a way to take cars from one region of Ottawa and move them through to another.
No, I think being a regional trauma center, cars are going to be coming from everywhere. The catch is how are we going to channel some of that activity in terms of a proper access plan and create those points. And the other point I will just make, and part of the challenge we have, and this is why we need 2 years to work through this with city staff and NCC and others, is if the ministry, with our discussions, changes the plans of what we will have in terms of number of beds or ambulatory care or what we're doing for research, it may change some of the orientation of the site, which changes the access. So we've got a concept. We've got a couple of years of work here to pin down what we've just talked about.
I'll leave it, Chair. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to first echo the Chair's comments about the amount of outreach the hospital's done within the last couple of years. Certainly, this is moving into River Ward, and this impacts in the immediate area 4 wards, and I just wanted to acknowledge the working relationship that we have had with the hospital, and that work will continue, so thank you. Mr. Love, I read a motion a few hours ago with respect to green space, the retention and preservation of green space. You and I have talked about this. This tries to echo concerns that we've heard in the community for quite some time. Can you just confirm for the committee that the Ottawa Hospital supports the motion that we'll be voting on later?
Yes, we do.
Okay, thank you. I won't talk about public transit this time. I do have a question, though, about the Dow's Lake Pavilion and the parking that's provided. Can you just explain what the plan is to ensure that the parking lot, which is now part of your 50 acres, is still going to provide adequate parking for that pavilion and the visitors of the area?
Yeah, so as part of our lease with PSPC Public Works, we have a provision in there that we will, in all of our planning scenarios, we have to maintain the access to approximately the 200 spaces, and I think there's 7 bus spaces that are built into that. So what we have said is, until we're ready to build, that lot will as is, it'll be run, I guess it's on our land, so to speak now, but it'll just continue. Part of the plan, Councillor Wellington, is as we get through this development strategy and parking strategy, whether it's if it's below ground area, we will commit to ensure that in that quadrant there still continues to be the 200 spaces. How it's configured, how it's looked, we have to go through the planning process, but we've committed that as part of the lease, and as part of our plan we'll ensure it's embedded.
So original wording of somewhere within the 50 acres is off the table, and you're now looking at that quadrant?
The wording, I have to go back and look at it specifically. I think it would allow us, if we really, really wanted to move it up the hill, but in terms of access and people moving in that area, as we start to think about, to Councillor Leeper's point around what we're doing with light rail and light rail stations, that will be embedded in that pink zone that's down there. It would make to have everybody traversing all the way to the top of the hill from a Dow's Lake perspective, so it'll be down in that quadrant.
Good. Madam Chair, I have lots of interest and questions about things not related to the planning concepts that are before us today, transportation, the design, transit. We'll certainly work through that as this continues to evolve, but those are my questions for Mr. Love. I would just ask that you be somewhat lenient, so when we get into Q&A with staff, if there are questions that Mr. Love can answer, that he be allowed to come back and take those questions.
Sure. But really, this is what's going to change here. We're going to, when we close the delegation, we're going to just what connects with what we're actually talking about today. Because when do you hope, if everything, we raise $500 million locally, et cetera, if all the funding comes through, if everything is just Roger, When would you be opening the doors of the first phase for the first time?
Based on where we're at with approvals, we're still looking that we'd be opening in 26, 27. So we're
2026, 2027, so I really, really think that we can have a discussion several times more between now and then and not get into a lot of questions of the staff. The staff are going to answer questions on what is before us today. I think that what you've seen, and I mean, really, as I said at the beginning, I've never seen a situation where 4 councillors that are immediately around, they have written such good and extensive comments that are really, I think, setting the stage for how well the hospital has been working with the city and with all of you, and how they intend to go forward. I think that's a given.
We agree. I just asked a minor process question that Mr. Lev be permitted to answer questions, if any came up further from committee members.
If it happens to be on what's before us only.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. That's it. So now, thank you, Mr. Love. All right. So who's going to be first? Who please tell me as a group, because we're at the witching hour, which I know I'm the only here probably. We're at the witching hour, and that is 12:30. Now, we're rarely here this long, so I don't have to ask you, but this is normally the time we would break for lunch. I want to get through I want to get through Roosevelt, so those people that are here from McRae, feel free to go and grab some lunch, if you wish. It's up to you, because I imagine that as soon as we're finished with the Civic, we will start on Roosevelt. I know there's a lot of people out to speak to that as well, so just being conscious of your tummies and wise intake of food at good times. All right, so who is asking questions of staff about the zoning bylaw amendment, official plan amendment for part of 930 Carling Avenue and 520 Preston Street? Is anybody besides Councillor Leeper and Brockington, because I want to give you an opportunity. So they've already asked a lot of questions. So we'll go first with Councillor Nussbaum. Anybody else? Okay, Councillor Nussbaum, then Councillor Brockington. We'll do it in reverse this time. Councillor Leeper. So I still didn't ask you, so do you agree that we will continue on? And if you're, if you need some sustenance, do you ask your staff or somebody to bring something? Or 3. We're not breaking after the hospital. We're going with the next one, which is Roosevelt. Okay. So, Councillor Nussbaum?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to staff for the presentation and for all the public delegations. Just a very, very quick question on the UDRP comments on this matter, which I thought were very sensible. And I did notice, and I was sort of looking at one stage to see whether those had been captured in some of the policy on page 40 of the staff report, and I did actually find the one I was looking for. And also, this can be a very quick question. I'm assuming that staff agree with the broad commentary from the UDRP, which we also heard from a number of public delegations, that whatever we end up with in terms of a final built form at the end of the day, it really ought to speak more to Carling Avenue, and there needs to be more of an urban edge to Carling Avenue. That was a comment I saw on the UDRP, and I see that at the bottom of page 40. So can you reassure me on that?
Yes, Madam Chair, that is reflective of staff comments as well, so we certainly support the UDRP comments to that regard.
Great, thank you. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Councillor Nussbaum. I so appreciate it. There will be a prize for you. Councillor Brockington and Councillor Leeper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In the beginning, I have just a few questions. I've already said how appreciative I am of hospital staff working closely with our own staff, Madam Chair. I wanted to acknowledge them, and I would like to acknowledge that the gallery is not filled with Riverward residents. They've been engaged in this process. Community Association is part of the engagement group or working groups that the hospital has established. And we acknowledge that there will be some secondary issues that have to be ironed out, but this is a time for speaking as well, so I just want to...
Well, I didn't say that, so now we'll clarify that.
So you're going to take questions and then you're going to have speakers.
Well, that would be really foolish of me since there's only two people that have...
So I'm blending it all, Madam Chair. I want to acknowledge, since this is really my only opportunity, of the work that's happened and the appreciation that exists in my community. Two questions that we heard today from delegations. One is the whole issue regarding the UNESCO heritage designation. Is that in jeopardy? Does that need to be reviewed? Does staff do anything in that regard?
The requirements for a cultural heritage impact statement are embedded in the official plan, so we reinforce that through the second. So it's already embedded that whatever developed on this site, hospital or no hospital, because part of the site is in a mixed-use center designation currently, has to go through that process. So nothing changes.
Okay. And the second question is, what study of the studies that the hospital is required to go through assesses risks associated with earthquake?
Upon site plan control submission, they would submit a geotechnical report, and that report would address that concern or look into that. And it would dictate what type of building would have to be designed, and the Ontario Building Code as well would have to inform the design.
Thank you.
Just to add to that, as part of the transfer from the federal government, there was already a fairly in-depth analysis of that because that obviously would have been a concern for the hospital as well.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I'll just say that my comments are clear in the report. I'm supportive of the application to rezone, and I will be voting in favor of this today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Leeper.
Thank you. One of the, and I should echo as well, thank you very much for your work on this. It has been a good working relationship for sure, both with myself and with the community. One of the key holds in what is being suggested here, transportation impact assessment. I'd like to understand more about what that is. What would be its timing? What are the methodologies? What are the data sources that you're using? And then what are any thresholds of acceptability? How do we determine, after completing what the expected impacts, the transportation impacts are going to be, do we determine that those impacts can either be mitigated through measures that are funded, irrelevant, or things that would actually say, no, we can't provide you with the zoning yet? And who determines that?
As Mr. Love indicated, I think over the next year or so we'll be working to frame that study. And I think it would be entirely appropriate to share the terms of reference that get put together on that. Obviously, we'll be looking at modes of transportation that we've talked about, travel demand management strategies on the part of the hospital I think will be important. You mentioned tying into the transit stations could be critical. Of course, there's the whole question of funding that'll have to be worked through. Certainly, with any development, we look to mitigate impacts, including transportation impacts. So that will be obviously a key component. Off-site parking issues, all those things will be considered and addressed through this beast of a study. So don't have the answers for you today, but I think we're more than willing to share with you. And I know there's a community engagement group or groups that will be looking at all as well. So it'll be a fulsome discussion.
Okay, so it's too early to get into details is what I'm hearing, but you are willing to share those terms of reference before they're implemented, give us an opportunity for input into that?
Certainly at the staff level, we'd be pleased to share that.
Yeah. Fantastic. And integration, you did mention it really briefly, integration of the O-Train future LRT into the hospital. Do you have some notion of what would be an acceptable integration?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Through our engagement, we heard a direct connection was very important, and through the hospital's planning to date, they're certainly focusing in on an integrated connection into the building. We're not just talking pathways. So how do we make that physical, concrete, pardon the pun, connection that will serve the hospital and the users of the hospital in the best way?
So there's no
we haven't established any thresholds yet with respect to what would be an acceptable integration.
No, that's correct, Madam Chair. There's certainly the policies that we created are very clear in terms of that direction. You know, the city wants that, the hospital wants that, we want that to happen. How that's going to happen hasn't been determined. And of course, that will come back to Planning Committee and Council as well.
And that's my final question, Chair, was, with respect to when these holds get lifted, can you just take me through that process? Who decides that the holds have been, the conditions have been met?
Certainly, Madam Chair. Normally, when the holding provisions are established, it's a delegated authority. When the conditions have been met, staff write a delegated authority report, and the bylaw goes directly to Council. Given the situation, the interest, the complexity, all the issues, the commitment here and the direction embedded is that it will come back to Planning Committee and Council. So how all the holding provisions have been met, in my mind, I see that coming with the master plan for the campus as well. So here's the master plan, here's all the studies that were done, here's how all the holding provisions have been addressed. Planning Committee, this is our recommendation.
Okay, and that's what I would look forward to. Chair, that was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's good. Okay, so we have a motion from Councillor Brockington. Is that carried? Carried. And is the item carried as amended? Carried. Carried. So good luck to you, Mr. I almost keep calling you, want to call you doctor. I don't know why. But good luck, because you have a lot of work before you, and certainly be there to do our part. Very engaged city on this topic. Thank you. All right, so now we're going directly to our next item, which is zoning bylaw amendment in 398, 402, and 406 Roosevelt Avenue. We have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 speakers on this. We're going to go right to the speakers. I'm going to ask Darcy Cote to come up and take this mic, and Roxanne Buckle to take this mic. Welcome, Mr. Cote. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, members of the committee. I'm a resident of the area. I live in Westboro Station, 575 Byron. My initial reason for being there is a great location, and mostly because of the neighborhood. I first heard of this when I came back from my holidays this winter, and we became a little energized on it. When I got into the details, reviewing all of the documentation, bylaws, zoning laws, etc., I became quite mystified as to how an R3 zone evolved through a Main Street zone into an R5. And I'm still mystified. But I will say that having read Mr. Leeper's comments, I am fully behind them, in favor of them. Quite simply, if this project goes ahead, in my opinion, it will be to the detriment of the whole community and probably citywide. This is what I call creepitis. And we just can't let this happen. All of that, I feel that I am opposed completely to this proposition. And that's all I really have to say on it. Thank you very much for your time.
I just have a question. Did you say creepitis?
Sorry?
Did you say creepitis?
Yes.
That's a new word.
Mm-hmm. It's when things creep into a neighborhood.
I bet you Google would have fun.
I would just like to add one more quick comment. on all of our surveys throughout the neighborhood, I've yet to find one single person that's in favor of this development. And we have done a lot of canvassing. There are neutrals, but none that are in favor. So once again, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, sir. So Roxanne, you're next, and Gary Kugler. Gary, can you come and take a chair, please? Go ahead, Roxanne. And you're speaking on, you're reading a submission.
Yes, I'm speaking on behalf of Leanne McGregor. And so my words are her words. Madam Chair, members of the Planning Committee, since I'm unable to attend this public consultation, this statement is being read by my proxy, Roxanne Buckle. Hello, my name is Leanne McGregor. I'm the owner of 378-380 Roosevelt Avenue, a century-old house that's one of the last remaining landmarks of history, and a property that has been in my family since 1982. Over the past 36 years, I've seen many changes in our neighborhood, some positive, negative. Subsequently, I've participated in more of these consultations than I care to remember, and in organizing these comments, I could simply revert to the laundry list of objections I've raised time and time again: the noise and dirt of construction, the nerve-wracking and house-shaking effects of excavation, the damage inflicted on a street long overdue for major repairs, the danger and confusion caused by multiple construction vehicles parked on both sides of the street, traffic problems created by construction vehicles entering and exiting a street with only one access point, the destruction of trees and natural habitat, the loss of our neighborhood's character, the preservation of which is ironically embedded in zoning standards, and so on. If this isn't enough to get the attention of local politicians, and it rarely is, the proposal currently under consideration raises yet another objection, one that I hope the decision makers at City Hall will recognize as an undeniable impediment to its approval, that being the audacious overreach on the part of domiciled developments with respect to the zoning restrictions that apply to the three properties in question, 398, 402, and 406 Roosevelt Avenue. Clearly stated, R3 zoning allows for the construction of, quote, 3-unit detached, duplex, linked detached, and semi-detached dwellings, unquote. A far cry from the, quote, 6-story mixed-use building, including 2 commercial units, 35 dwelling units, underground parking, and rear surface parking, close quote, that Domicile is planning to build. The scope of this proposal is such that the request for an amendment to the current zoning parameters is an understatement in the extreme. Rather, Domicile is asking, dare I say expecting, that the people tasked with first making recommendations and then deciding on the fate of the proposed development will utterly disregard the applicable development standards, rendering them null and void. It is on this basis, therefore, that I make my appeal. Zoning restrictions aren't suggestions. They're standards embedded in law, standards upon which people base the decision to buy a house in a given neighborhood. As such, these standards represent a de facto contract between the city and its residences that ensure stability and predictability in the evolution of residential communities. To set these standards aside or dilute them in any significant way will send the message that zoning bylaws carry little weight in the City of Ottawa. Residents of Ottawa deserve better. Therefore, I call upon the decision makers at the City of Ottawa to honor the standards and limitations made explicit by R3 zoning, and in so doing serve notice to Domicile and other developers that any vision for the development of established residential neighborhoods must comply with existing zoning standards. Finally, with a second multi-unit development under consideration at the other end of our short dead-end block,
I want to add that it's becoming increasingly clear that the city has a vision for the slice of Westboro running from Byron to the Transitway that deviates considerably from the single and semi-detached houses that have long been the norm. If this is the case, I strongly suggest that the city stop treating homeowners as squatters, come clean about its long-term vision, and work with residents in negotiating a plan that recognizes the value we've built into our properties over the years, rather than leaving us to offload our homes to lowball offers from developers. Respectfully, Leanne McGregor, 378, 380 Roosevelt Avenue.
Okay, so just so you know, I haven't had to say, thank you, ma'am. Haven't had to say this in a long time. Actually, since, well, I don't know what it was. We all know what it was. So you don't get to cheer, and you don't get to boo. If I had allowed one, I wouldn't have to allow the other. So those are the rules. So next up, I would call Bill Lamb to come up and sit in this chair, Bill. And go ahead, please, Mr. Is it Kugler? Welcome. Thank you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunities to speak today. I am against this zoning amendment. As a resident of Berkeley Avenue, this proposed building would actually be in my backyard. The disbelief I felt about the prospect of this building actually being approved turned to great concern after I attended the neighborhood meeting where the developer presented its plans to the community. Despite the fact that residents were totally opposed to the project for numerous reasons, such as increased street congestion and decreased parking for its residents, it still seemed to me that our concerns were not being heard. Despite the city's urban design committee saying the building was too large and did not fit the street, or City Councillor Leeper speaking out against this project, it still appeared the project was moving forward. I sincerely hope that this committee today hears our concerns, taking into consideration what's best for the local residents. I'm told that the decision is all based on the official plan and how this property falls within its guidelines because of its proximity to Richmond Road to the south and to the light rail to the north. It's all about intensification within these boundaries, and the developer, certainly aware of this plan, has taken the opportunity to piece together 3 residential properties where, if rezoned, they would be able to construct a condo building. Intensification is all well and good, but not if it's done without concern for the surrounding neighborhood. Roosevelt is already loaded with planned intensification. This short, dead-end street has 2 major projects slated for its north end. As well, the homes backing on the proposed site will be overwhelmed by a massive building and a parking lot only a few meters from their backyards. The residents on Roosevelt and Berkeley bought their homes in good faith, never imagining the R3 zoning would be permitted to change. Just because the developer has been able to capitalize on a real estate deal doesn't mean that they should be given the right to disrupt a neighborhood. Domicile is certainly entitled to ask for a zoning change to up a 6-story condo, but they are in business, and after this project, they will move on to the next one. The residents of this neighborhood who will be left to deal with the consequences of its over-intensification are here for the long term and are now putting their trust in this planning committee not to support this amendment request, but rather to do what's fair, what's right, and in the best interest of the people they represent. That is, not to approve the zoning amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Mr. Lamb, you're up next, but then is Isabel Wissing-Martineau here? Isabel, come and take Mr. Kugler's spot, please. Go ahead, Mr. Lamb. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you for your time and your attention. I am speaking against this.
I am a resident of 575 Byron Avenue, which is at the corner of Roosevelt and Byron. I have 3 points that I would like to make. The first one was about the public meeting, which I was not in attendance as I was out of the country. In reading the notes about it and the report that was sent, I had some issues about that. The issues that were brought up and have been spoken about with respect to traffic, pedestrian traffic, cycling traffic, and so forth, seem to have been answered by your staff at this meeting. However, the answers to me were very incomplete. I will give you some suggestions or some examples. Residents were concerned about additional building features beyond the proposed 6 stories. And the answer was projections are permitted above the height limit provided they comply with provisions of the zoning bylaw. Many of the answers seem to include the phrase, the proposed development supports the official plan policies for intensification, seeming to put that forward as a reason for allowing this development, that it's supported by the official plan, so let's do it. One of the things that one of the persons mentioned was that there is a target density of 200 people per acre, and the staff response was that this proposed development did not rely on the argument for meeting density targets. To me, a negative. One of the things that was asked about was the Roosevelt-Richmond intersection and the traffic at that point. And the staff response was the proposed development has been reviewed with respect to traffic impacts. Nowhere in the answer was there any facts put forward that there were so many cars through this intersection and that they don't expect any more. I asked the staff, was a traffic review carried out? What were the facts that were associated with that made them make the decision or have the decision to make the recommendation to you? One of the things was the endangering pedestrians and cyclists that use Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt is the only intersection that is a cross street there, and many of the pedestrians, cyclists, running room people use that route because they cross at the light and then use Roosevelt to go down to the Parkway and to Scott Street as a cycle thing. So it's a well-used street. Were any surveys done about what the use is as a bicycling route down to Scott Street, or how many pedestrians do go down there? So to me, there was a lot of answers there that just, weren't put forward. My second point is the current status of the street. On Roosevelt right now, there are 24 new infill doubles out of 37 properties. So half of these have been changed to infill already. And that's been done within the last 5 to 10 years. Almost all of those are brand new houses. There are three brand new ones in construction right now. One of them is behind the proposed property, one is beside it, and one is just this week they dug the foundation for it, 3 units down. As well, and I don't know whether the staff has let you know, this is a very high-density area already. Within 600 meters of the proposed LRT station, there are approximately 800 condominium and apartment units already. Why are we adding 5 more into an area that is a residential quiet area? If this is going to occur, should these large places not be put in the areas of TM zoning? One of the areas of TM zoning is the Tubman Funeral Home, which is right at the intersection, and it is my understanding that a proposal has been made to sell the place.
or an offer's been made to buy the place. I don't know if that is
Sir, you
going
only have
through
a
or
couple of
not.
seconds left, so I wouldn't.
Yeah. The other thing is that further down the street at Rochester Park, there are two areas to be rezoned TM in Rochester Park, and that also could be looked at for future development, not in the residential area.
Sir, I've given you some extra time.
Thank you.
I hate to do that.
No, that's
people
fine.
in this
I
room
am
are going
finished
like,
my
how
point.
come I didn't get extra, right? Anyway, thank you very much, sir, for coming out and for bringing up some new points. We'll go over to Isabel Wissing-Martineau, and Gary, you can come in and take Mr. Lamb's chair. Thank you, sir. Gary Luddington.
So, chers membres du c'est bon? Chers membres du Conseil, my request to the Planning Committee today is to reject the zoning bylaw amendment. My understanding of the official plan and secondary plan differs significantly with the city staff or whomever wrote the report was sent to you. First, I disagree with the following key argument that you find in the planning rationale, in the conclusion, in the recommendation. Something along the lines that the proposed development is consistent with policies by providing a mixed-use building that supports transit while providing sensitive and compatible intensification. As my fellow person mentioned before, talking about intensification is very nice and is kind of a buzzword these days in the city, but the official plan doesn't support it for that particular street. What is being proposed is an over-intensification of that street. The minimum density target for our area has been reached since 2006, so you cannot use intensification as an argument. And additionally, in the official plan, what you find is the Article 2.2.2.12, which says that these targets shall not be used as the only planning rationale for approving additional height or density in excess of the current zoning. Intensification might not be the only argument city staff uses, but it's one that comes back everywhere in their arguments. Also, as it was mentioned before, let's not forget the Fender site that will have maybe 8 or more stories to those buildings at the end of that street, and the 4-story building that will be built also at the north end of the street. Intensification should be better distributed across the city or across the neighborhood. It should not be concentrated on that dead-end street. Lastly, about intensification, what I fear most also for people that may not live there is that with intensification, when it happens quickly, the crime rate increases as well. And that we have started seeing in our neighborhood. Graffitis on garage doors, graffitis on front doors. It counts. The report argues that 6 stories is within the permitted height range for the general urban area and within the range permitted in Sector 5. What I do not understand and what I didn't in the report is that it doesn't take into consideration the revised Schedule C2, which was voted by this council in 2014. The point I'm making here is that that schedule had already phase 2 of the LRT development being approved for that. It was approved in 2013. For that revised Schedule 2, you had in hand transit-oriented development guidelines, which were given and approved in 2007. So why would you change the zoning now when it was voted and agreed upon, and you had pretty much the same data as of today to make the decision? I don't understand. The report wrongly states that the development is compatible with established neighborhood. That's on page 6 of your report. Well, the report states very well, though, that all comments received from the public consultation were in disagreement with the proposed zoning amendment. 67 comments is a consensus against the proposal when you consider the size of that street. The person before me said 37 properties on that street. You had 67 comments against it. Why and that I do not know, but why not purchase the site across the street? That was brought up during the public consultation. It seemed that it was for sale. Why did domicile didn't purchase that land instead of asking for a rezoning of R3 properties? Also, sometimes I heard the argument that because it's a TM, I need to accelerate, because the funeral home is TM, so then the properties in front of it could be TM as well. Well, do not forget that behind the funeral home are businesses, not residential properties, semi-detached that people paid $1 million for. The report states that the project would not attract high volume traffic from outside the area. Well, in the report and what you will be voting today, they are asking that medical facilities, restaurants, retail food store be added to the list of businesses allowed. That's pretty much my point. I hope you will vote with respect with Westboro Village. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Michael Olson. Michael is the author of putting this report together that we just received. Go ahead, Gary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Most of our comments from the Westboro Community Association have already been submitted. There's a couple of points we wanted to bring up. I'm the chair, and I'm here today with our vice chair, Karen Johnson. The original we were one of the original proponents for the CDP for Westboro and Richmond Road. And this came as a result of the Real Canadian Superstore coming on the scene. And we saw what happened when, and probably I doubt very many of you would realize, there used to be a Dominion store on Richmond Road, which is now Mountain Equipment Co-op. And John Doran said to me one day, he said, you know, I see all the traffic going in and out of that Mountain Equipment Co-op parking lot. I said, I'm going to buy up what comes available. So the original, as an original proponent for the CDP, working with staff, and some of them are no longer with the city. Doug James is still here, and I can remember going back into that period of time and him being before us. One of the things we tried to do was ensure that the Main Street aspect of Richmond Road didn't creep into the residential R3, R3S factor, which is on both sides of Richmond Road. And there's some R4. Unfortunately, this isn't creep. This is one hell of a big jump into the pond, going into the R3 zoning. There are homes that are going to, if this is approved, there's homes that are going to be right behind this to the west. There are homes that are going to be slightly right next door to the north and across the street to the north. The number of people who came out to the public meeting is reflected on the comments you've received. And I think that's something that you have to take into consideration when looking at what you're going to do here today. The issue of traffic and parking has been brought up time and time again, and one of the things that we may have forgotten is that Uniform Developments owns a big chunk of property at the north end of this street, just south, right up against the transitway. And they are looking, the last word I had from Mr. McDougall was building 2 towers. They're back because of the proximity to the LRT station. They are looking to go back to where they were when this was taken to the OMB, and the OMB actually denied their application for the rezoning. I guess one final thing that we're looking at is that the Urban Design Review Panel made quite a number of recommendations as to what they thought should be done if this is going to be built. And virtually, if my memory serves me correctly, and it's going downhill lately, all of the recommendations were turned down by domicile. All. So why do we go through this process and then things just don't seem to want to turn out for the best? And I guess the other question is, what is going to be the benefit if this is approved to the community? We don't see any. The recommendation coming out of the public meeting was, this would be a nice building on Richmond Road. And I can show you some places on Richmond Road where we have some not nice buildings that have been built recently. And thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Okay, Michael, you're ready to go. Daniel Spence. Daniel, are you here? Come and have this seat. Mr. Olson, you have 5 minutes. Thank you very much for this.
Yes, my name is Mike Olson. I live at 575 Byron Avenue, Suite 710. We look directly down Roosevelt Street. My particular concern is the fact that we brought into that building because of the view. I know I've talked to some lawyers, they have said that views do not count. I then basically researched on Google around other jurisdictions around the world, and I do see that in the planning process, good planning processes incorporate residents' views, and in Australia they have that. At the back of that, this document is a copy of a couple of documents on basically views. In my case, we will lose what I call a $1 million view. Unfortunately, I didn't get any chance to bring any slides today. This was put together by a very fast committee in the last 2 days. Matter of fact, this came off the press at 5:30 on Saturday afternoon. And I decided that we should do this. If you turn over to page 2, we put it in, this objection is from the residents. We had basically a petition that was sent out this week, and this is backed up on the third portion. However, on page, the first page, referred to is the overview the first is the contents. If we go to the contents, the people that were involved in putting this together is on the 2, and then if you go over this, the way we put this together was to basically put document 3, which was the page 19 and 12 of the planning report, public input on February the 20th. The second document was the page 10 to 12, the planning report by Councillor Jeff Leeper. And our comments, you've already heard from David, is at the bottom, Bill Lamb and myself. In my particular case, I mentioned about loss of view. I will also mention that Mr. Darcy Reed, who is 2 floors below us, his property is worth $1.6 million. He's going to lose pretty close to about $1 million because he has a double unit which faces right over the Ottawa River to the Gatineau Hills. Many of us have bought into that property because we were told that R3 would be there forever. Now we're finding out that basically there is an application to try and convert it to an R5, a Main Street. If you now to page over to our summary, which is on, unfortunately, because this was put together very quickly, we didn't have time to number the pages, but if you go over to the summary of our particular, on page, I think it's, let me see, it's regarding our comments on how the committee, overview summary, it's after Jeff Lipper's piece there. So here, basically what we're saying, a small committee of very concerned owners of condo
889 Westboro Station, consisting of towers 2 and 3, 575 Byron Avenue, was quickly formed during the week of Monday the 14th. To oppose the recommending of the zoning bylaws amended 398, 402, and 406 Roosevelt Avenue for approval by the City of Ottawa Planning Committee scheduled for today. As a result of the reading and learning about the public input at a meeting held February the 20th, see Planning Committee Report, May 22nd, 2018, Document 3, Consultation, page 19 to 22. 67 residents were all opposed to the height and traffic impacts being the main concern. Our elected City Councillor, Jeff Lever, see page 10 to 12, report to Planning Committee on 22nd of May 18, comments by the Ward Councillor strongly opposes the developer, Domicile Developments Inc. application and planning staff report, recommending points 1 and 2, report to Planning Committee. Rezoning of Roosevelt from R3 residential to an R5 Main Street, opposition, input from our surrounding community as well as input from our...
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
I'm just checking where you live at 575 Byron.
Yep.
Councillor Leeper has a question for you.
Okay. Thanks, and you know, I'm sure councillors will have a chance to take a look at the package that you've delivered. I want to take it. What is the key point that you would like to make to this committee?
That basically 100% of all the residents that live in that area are opposed to this motion, and we ask you to deny the application.
What is that fundamental opposition?
That opposition is 41 units responded to the petition. Okay. And also last night I have 13 signed petition from 13 residents, which were collected last night.
Yeah, and, unfortunately, I mean, I wish planning was a vote, because we'd be able to stop a lot more developments. I think what I heard you say during your, and I just want to see if you agree with this, that there is a fundamental issue of unfairness with respect to this application.
Correct.
What is that unfairness? What is that fundamental unfairness that you see?
The unfairness is the fact that we are violating the official plan and we're not conforming to the R3 requirements.
Did you look at, when you moved in, did you look at that R3?
Not when we moved in originally. We were told that basically that this area in front of us would be like that for, it's an R3 zoning. It would not change.
And now they're proposing to make it an R5.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Before we go to our next delegation, I want to ask Kirsten Meach. Kirsten, I just wanted to ask you because I think it's important. We still have several people left, not like several, not several as we had, but I still think the question that you need to answer is why did you approve the application? What caused you to do that?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So
just hang on a second. So, Mr. Olson, you can go back in the audience, and Heather Nicholson, you can come and sit in this chair. Go ahead.
Thank you. Just to give a bit more context, the site is located within 450 meters walking distance of Dominion Station. So that's within the 600-meter transit area. So looking at the official plan policies, intensification is permitted outside of target areas. Your target areas are your traditional main streets, arterial main streets, etc. This site is immediately adjacent to a traditional main street. So it's 18 years away. It's the first site right off the traditional main street. And the proposal that we see here provides a transition and compatibility to the existing residential neighborhood. So that's also the other important consideration. So within transit, but also a compatible design. So the proposal includes 6 stories, but it also does step down to 4 stories immediately adjacent to the R3 neighborhood. So you have compatibility there with 3 stories up to 4 stories. then up to 6 stories. We also looked at compatibility with the plan context. So looking on the east side of Roosevelt Avenue, we have a large site, that's the Tubman site that many residents have referred to, is zoned for traditional Main Street as well, and that permits 4 to 6 stories. So the plan context provides that development as well as those uses that will be introduced, so minor commercial uses, perhaps also residential. And then also, I'll just flip. So if we just take a look at the zoning as well, we can see that traditional Main Street is not linear. So the traditional Main Street is, I guess, acts in a sawtooth matter. It does take into consideration side streets and looks beyond just that front facing on Richmond Road. So through the zoning and through the feedback that we heard from residents, as well as our planning analysis, we feel that by providing that transition from R3 to R5, but also limiting commercial uses to oriented uses, and also very notably limiting the size of those uses so that you do get those local residents walking or using alternative modes of transportation, that the compatibility and that transition from the traditional Main Street to the residential is present through the design.
That's great, thank you very much. Where am I going? So Daniel Spence, and then and Heather, you'll be after Daniel. Thank you. You have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank
Welcome.
So my day job is I'm a sustainable transportation manager for a large institution. I work in the parking and safety department there. So my perspective on this is not just as somebody who actually lives in the middle of that block. I live on Roosevelt Avenue, a few lots up from this, but I also look at it from a sustainable transportation, cycling, pedestrian, and safety aspect. And I think that there's definitely a strong public safety element of this that is possibly overlooked. For one thing, it's been touched on a little bit about the high number of cyclists that come through this patch because it is the only crossover to the River Parkway between basically Woodruff, Lincoln Fields kind of area and Island Park Drive. It's the only way you can get over to the recreational pathways. We were just sitting out doing some gardening yesterday, just noticing what a highway it is of people going through there. Having the number of people parking on the street that we already have, there are already people constantly parking on the wrong side of the street, which narrows it to a single lane, which means that cyclists are deking out into the other side of the lane, not necessarily aware of the car coming in the opposite direction. This is made even more dangerous by the state of the roadway itself. It has not seen repairs in many years. All of the construction that has happened, all of the intensification that has already happened on the street has resulted in a patchwork of cold patch and other repairs that do not hold up for the whole season. I think there's a cold patch truck through there at least 4 or 5 times a year. But that also makes it very difficult for a cyclist trying to navigate through that because it's so bumpy. You have to go at a slower speed. People coming up behind you who have gone down the street realize there's no parking. They're in a rush to get to their dentist appointment or whatever. There's a cyclist plodding along ahead of them, going at a safe speed, trying not to fall over because of these potholes that are underwater. You've got lakes because of the drainage as well. So you've got a person trying to overtake that cyclist, dangerously coming out around them, splashing them, any number of issues. So it's unsafe currently sometimes, and it would be much worse with doubling the number of units that would be permitted on this street. The other aspect of safety is the intersection at Roosevelt and Richmond. If you just spend any time there, you see how nuts it is. The parking lot for the building, the commercial building facing onto Richmond, comes out onto Roosevelt. It is less than a single car's length from the stop bar. And it's a Starbucks and a Canada Post. So it's a high traffic, high turnover parking lot. People are constantly cutting out, cutting through between people, cutting in from the opposite direction, blocking traffic onto Richmond because they want to get in right away there. Adding to the number of people exiting during peak periods from slightly further up, you're going to wind up with more people trying to ease into traffic, again blocking cyclists flow through because they can't get through the person who is pulled out to try and get between the other people who are backed up. It's already, as I say, kind of nuts, and it's not going to get much better. The other aspect of safety is emergency access and emergency egress also. It is a concern, the fact that there is only one access point. There's no way to get out the north end of the street. So if there were ever a need for an evacuation, if there were ever a need for emergency vehicles to get through there during peak times, it is very difficult to see how people would be able to get out of that street in a timely way, in an expedient way. So that's the gist of my concerns, and very much opposed to it.
Thank you. It's a lot of information. Thanks, I appreciate it. Okay. So James Chapman, are you here, James? Come and take a seat where Mr. Spence was. Okay, Heather Nicholson, you have 5 minutes.
Well, I want to thank you, and I'm sorry for the clapping. This is the first time I've been here, so I'm not used to that.
Well, I'm glad you brought beautiful flowers.
Well, it is a reflection of what I remember of Westboro when I first moved there 40 plus years ago. And from across the street there was a cottage, and along the cottage was totally lined with beautiful lilacs, which are no longer there. And for me, the things that are missing in Westboro are the small beauties that is being taken up by bigger and bigger and bigger and more. And I'm feeling that pretty soon we won't have any space or any beauty. And also I feel that nothing away from domicile. I'm glad they're making money, and I'm glad they're progressing, but I feel that we need to put something out there that people will be proud of. And the buildings that are being put up in Westboro right now are, to me, are big chunks of buildings, and something like parks and birds and trees are no longer viable. And when we build to the degree that we're building right now and eliminate green spaces, you end up with a community that is endangered in health-wise. So you end up with people with different things that take them to the hospital, because you've eliminated spaces of relaxation and spaces where people can go and feel a bit of quiet. I'm sorry I'm not as organized as I would normally be. I just got this today because I wasn't home. So I was trying to rush through it, and I was trying to get my thoughts together. And so I'm a little bit rushed. One of the things I find about the builders coming into the neighborhood is there is such a disrespect by the builders. They come in, they take over the street, they play loud music, there is no respect, and what I'm finding now is on Sundays, the only day of the week that we feel that it is the day of comfort and away from the noise, because Westboro is built on bedrock. And every person and every builder that comes in there, the pounding is unimaginable, and you don't even have to live close. I'm on Winston, which backs onto Roosevelt. I've been there for over 40 years, and let me tell you, I am nuts. I have gotten to a place now where I feel that the builders should almost come and speak to the residences that have been there and appreciate what they have had to put up with before they come in and take over. And I know the city needs the money. I know tax dollars are important for water, street, sewer, lights, whatever, but at what degree do we stop the intensification? We are already full in Westboro. You've got $1 million properties. You say that you put these buildings here so the transit way and all the things that are close by is in transit distance or walking distance. These are $1 million properties with 2 cars. They're not walking. They're not meshing with the public transit with the major unwashed. they get into their luxury vehicle and they drive. So when there was something here that really caught my eye in your, what the city put forward, was this, the staff says, the staff does not have any concern. And that ran all the way through your proposal. There is no concern for the amount of traffic that comes through Westboro. How does the staff, I almost feel that you should have boots on the street in Westboro. You should almost have one of your staff be a resident of Westboro to appreciate the things that we have had to put up with. I am sorry if I'm a little bit all over the place, but I haven't had a super amount of time, but I am so passionate about what has gone on over the years that have been there, and I have been there, let me tell you. I have seen it all, and now this is where we are, where we're putting up another glorious building that we'll all run to see. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Miguel, are you coming up by yourself? Yes. Okay, so you might as well come up and take this seat. Mr. Chapman, James Chapman.
Yes.
You have 5 minutes.
Okay. I'm a resident of 402 Berkeley, and I am opposed to the amendment. I hope the council...
Berkeley?
Yes, Berkeley.
Thank you.
I hope the council rejects the proposal. I want to say that I do agree with most of what has been said today so far.